Lana del Rey, born Elizabeth Grant, is an American singer and poet whose work revolves around the metaphysical concepts of mortality, religion, fate versus free will, aesthetic philosophy, and the pursuit of meaning in a tragic and fallen world. Plagued with questions about mortality from a young age, she reflects in an interview that, quote, "When I was very young, I was sort of floored by the fact that my mother and my father and everyone I knew was going to die one day, and myself too. I had a sort of philosophical crisis. I couldn't believe that we were mortal. For some reason, that knowledge sort of overshadowed my experience. I was unhappy for some time. I got into a lot of trouble. I used to drink a lot." And in response to her drinking problem, was sent away to boarding school at the age of 14. Concentrating her studies on metaphysics in high school, she was introduced to Nabokov's writing through a teacher she used to ride around town with, saying, quote, "In boarding school, to become a teacher, you don't have to have a master's. I was 15 and he was 22, out of Georgetown. He was young, and at school you were allowed to take trips out at the weekends. On our driving trips around the Connecticut counties, he introduced me to Nabokov, Ginsberg, Whitman, and even Tupac and Biggie. He was my gateway to inspirational culture. Those inspirations I got when I was 15 are still my only inspirations. I draw from that same well. It's one world I dip into to create other worlds. Like this philosopher Josiah Royce once said, 'Without the roots, you can't have any fruits.'" And while Lana draws upon countless literary sources throughout her discography, many of which we will be exploring in this video, no singular work compares in influence or inspiration or just sheer magnitude in her world building artistically than Vladimir Nabokov's 1955 novel, Lolita. Centered around a 12-year-old girl growing up in an East Coast American lake town as Lana did, with an antagonistic mother preparing to send her off to boarding school, the plot of the novel follows Lolita as she is groomed and kidnapped by a mentally insane, but movie star good-looking, pedophile named Humbert Humbert. And while the text is most well known for its shocking subject matter, a deeper read proves the text to be a philosophical masterpiece, full of its own metaphysical inquiries and narratives, and very well could have been Lana's first, and was definitely probably the most impactful, exploration of the anxieties and questions that plagued her throughout an isolated adolescence. Continuing on to earn a philosophy degree in college, Lana wrote prolifically throughout her teen and early adult years before finding fame in 2012 with her album Born to Die, which was widely, and in my opinion unfairly, criticized for aestheticizing and romanticizing Nabokov's novel. And while in response, her Lolita references became more subtle from that point onwards, as she references more obscure passages and themes from the book rather than choosing song names like Lolita, or singing the opening lines of the text as a refrain in Off to the Races, Lana has consistently spent the past decade of her music career steeping her art in the same narrative foundations, metaphysical inquiries, literary references, and philosophical concepts present in Vladimir Nabokov's work. And so, while I am aware of this video essay's length, I have spent the better part of 9 months on it, I promise that while the first 10 minutes may feel a bit tedious at points as I lay these shared foundational narratives between Lolita and Lana del Rey, the rest of the video unfolds seamlessly from that point onwards into a deeper philosophical, aesthetic, and psychological analysis of the deeper meanings in Lolita, as well as Lana del Rey's references to it. And so with that, baby, put on heart-shaped sunglasses, because we're going to take a ride. This is a metaphysical analysis of Lolita and Lana del Rey. Part 1. Paradise Lost. The beginning of Lolita is framed as a plea from our narrator, Humbert Humbert's murder trial, to us readers, the jury, to grant him salvation from his sins. And so while Lolita opens with the famous lines, "Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul," alongside a brief description of Dolores Hayes, the real name of Humbert's victim, he quickly goes on to set the foundations for his case by informing us of his tragic origin story, stating, "Did she have a precursor? She did. Indeed, she did. In point of fact, there might have been no Lolita at all, had I not loved, one summer, a certain initial girl child, in a princedom by the sea. Oh, when? About as many years before Lolita was born as my age was that summer. You can always count on a murderer for a fancy prose style. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, exhibit number 1 is what the seraphs, the misinformed, simple, noble-winged seraphs envied. Look at this tangle of thorns." He then introduces us to Annabel Lee, his first love at the age of 13, in a direct reference to the Edgar Allan Poe poem of the same name. On their last summer day together, they attempt to consummate their love on a French Riviera beach, but are interrupted just before, with Annabelle dying of typhus before they can meet again, leaving him with only her memory to obsess over. And to tell the story succinctly by abridging Poe's poem, quote, "I was a child and she was a child, in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabelle Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabelle Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabelle Lee." And so he lies by her seaside tomb for an eternity. And so in this sense, as in the poem, Humbert is cast out from his initial paradise by the angels for having a love greater than the happiness heaven could provide, and he is therefore given a curse of a lust for nymphets, even as he ages, and nymphets are described as such. Between the age limits of 9 and 14, there occur maidens who, to certain bewitched travelers twice or many times older than they, reveal their true nature, which is not human, but nymphic, that is, demoniac, and these chosen creatures I propose to designate as nymphets. It will be marked that I substitute time terms for spatial ones. In fact, I would have the reader see 9 and 14 as the boundaries of an enchanted island haunted by those nymphets of mine, and surrounded by a vast misty sea. And so while he tries to make do with adult relations as a grown man, he is still cursed by this desire for children, describing his condition as such. Humbert was perfectly capable of intercourse with Eve, but it was Lilith he longed for. And we will be exploring the Eve-Lilith distinction throughout this video, but with this explicitly religious imagery here, I'd like to introduce one of the main meta-narratives in both Lana del Rey's historiography as well as the plot of the text, Lolita, which is their shared backdrop with John Milton's poem Paradise Lost, which is a retelling of the Genesis creation story through a lens sympathetic to Satan. The epic poem opens with the fallen angel Satan in hell after being cast out of heaven by God, where he then plots his revenge through the corruption of man. And just as Satan traverses to God's new world of paradise to regain what he has lost, Humbert travels from the old world of Europe to the new world of America, where he takes up lodging with a widow named Charlotte and her 12-year-old daughter Dolores Hayes, where Humbert reflects on his origin story, saying, quote, "That little girl with her seaside limbs and ardent tongue haunted me ever since, until, at last, 24 years later, I broke her spell by incarnating her in another," and describes the moment he first sees Dolores as such. "Without the least warning, a blue sea wave swelled under my heart, and from a mat in a pool of sun, half naked, kneeling, turning about on her knees, there was my Riviera love, peering at me over dark glasses. The 25 years I had lived since then tapered to a palpitating point and vanished. I find it most difficult to express with adequate force that flash, that shiver, that impact of passionate recognition. In the course of the sunshot moment that my glance slithered over the kneeling child while I passed by her in my adult disguise, the vacuum of my soul managed to suck in every detail of her bright beauty, and these I checked against the features of my dead bride. All I want to stress is that my discovery of her was a fatal consequence of that princedom by the sea in my tortured past. Everything between the two events was but a series of gropings and blunders and false rudiments of joy. Everything they shared made one of them." Humbert becomes obsessed with Dolores from here on out, recording her every move in his diary and describing himself as, quote, "one of those inflated pale spiders you see in old gardens, sitting in the middle of a luminous web and giving little jerks to this or that strand, weaving a metaphorical silk web around the house to keep his, quote, beautiful warm-colored prey under his web of control, and describing the prismatic weave turning into old cobwebs whenever she's not home. He also describes himself as Humbert the Wounded Spider when she is acting outside of his desires, for instance when she's flirting with a neighbor boy named Kenneth Knight. And I bring up this spider metaphor because it will be another meta-narrative throughout, as an extended metaphor for fate throughout the novel, in line with the Greek myth of Arachne, in which a skilled mortal weaver compares herself to the gods, boasts superiority to the goddess Athena, and subsequently enters a weaving contest with the deity to prove it. And when it comes to Dolores and her mother's view of Humbert living in their house, they both very quickly develop a crush on him, as he is described as very attractive and having, quote, all the characteristics which, according to writers on the sex interests of children, start the responses stirring in a little girl. Clean-cut jaw, muscular hand, deep sonorous voice, broad shoulder. Moreover, I am said to resemble some crooner or actor chap on whom Lo has a crush. And while Humbert Humbert is perhaps one of the most well-known unreliable narrators in all of literature, this description of himself does seem to be accurate based on the way that women treat him in the novel, as well as Dolores having a movie magazine poster up on her wall with an actor that looks like Humbert writing his initials next to the picture. And with Dolores being described as a typical Bobby Soxer of the time period, we are specifically led to believe that he resembles Frank Sinatra. We also pick up from the beginning that Charlotte is hateful and envious and spiteful towards her daughter, with Humbert being aware that, quote, Mother Hayes hated my darling for her being sweet on me. And after humiliating her in front of Humbert for having a crush on him, Dolores acts out and refuses to attend church with her mother that Sunday, and finally, her and Humbert are alone. And this is where we get the first sexual contact between Humbert and Dolores Hayes. It's written very heavily with imagery from Paradise Lost, and Lana fans will immediately catch on to the lyrical references in the scene as well. I am, of course, going to cut it down for brevity as well as to remove some of the more graphic description, but it begins by saying, she wore that day a pretty print dress that I had seen on her once before. Ample in the skirt, tight in the bodice, short-sleeved, pink, checkered with darker pink, and, to complete the color scheme, she had painted her lips and was holding in her hollowed hands a beautiful, banal, Eden red apple. Humbert intercepted the apple. Give it back, she pleaded, showing the marbled flesh of her palms. I produced delicious. She grasped it and bit into it, and my heart was like snow under thin crimson skin. Then, with perfect simplicity, the impudent child extended her legs across my live lap. He then pleasures himself by rubbing her against his lap while singing the words of a foolish song that was then popular. Oh, my Carmen, my little Carmen, something something those something nights, and the stars and the cars and the bars and the barman. Stopping to tell us that, all the while I was mortally afraid that some act of God might interrupt me. The lyrics are then taken over by her, and her legs twitched a little as they lay across my live lap. There she lolled in the right-hand corner, almost asprawl, Lola the Bobby Soxer, devouring her immemorial fruit, singing through its juice. And upon realizing he is not to be interrupted with her as he was with Annabelle, remarks that, we were fantastically and divinely alone, as Eve and Satan were during her corruption. And getting closer to finishing, he says, the least pressure would suffice to set all paradise loose. And I kept repeating chance words after her. Barman, alarmin, my charmin, my Carmen. Amen, ahaha, men. And here we get to the first direct Lolita reference from Lana in this video, which is her song Carmen, which will actually be a narrative throughout the video because it represents so many plot points. But for this initial segment, I'll explore some of the lyrical similarities between her song and what the characters are singing at this point in the text. Quote, Carmen doesn't have a problem lying to herself 'cause her liquor's top shelf. It's alarming, honestly, how charming she can be, fooling everyone, telling them she's having fun. With reference to the lyrics Carmen, Charmin, Alarmin, Bars, and Barman, and on being all dressed up for church but having nowhere to go, we also get these lines. Baby's all dressed up with nowhere to go. That's the little story of the girl you know. Put your red dress on, put your lipstick on, sing your song. And this scene is also represented in an unreleased Lana track called Be My Daddy, where the apple is replaced with a lollipop, singing, sitting on your lap, singing you my song. Got a lollipop, I can give you some, all for you. If you're seeking heaven, then you want to come and get it, you can be my daddy tonight. With seeking heaven, a reference to the feeling Humbert is trying to regain from his time with Annabelle, saying, in the possession and thraldom of a nymphet, the enchanted traveler stands, as it were, beyond happiness, for there is no other bliss on earth comparable to that of fondling a nymphet. That bliss, it belongs to another class, another plane of sensitivity. And feeling himself to be godlike, he had ceased to be Humbert the Hound, the sad-eyed degenerate cur clasping the boot that would presently kick him away. I was above the tribulations of ridicule, beyond the possibilities of retribution. And just like in the Arachne metaphor, where Arachne is hubristically comparing herself to the gods, Humbert is wearing his quote-unquote royal robes, as he calls them, which is a purple robe just as Jesus wore during his crucifixion. And Humbert, believing that Dolores was unaware as to what was happening, describes her as being solipsized and says, "Thus I had delicately constructed my ignoble, ardent, sinful dream, and still Lolita was safe, and I was safe. What I had madly possessed was not she, but my own creation. Another, fanciful Lolita, perhaps more real than Lolita, overlapping, encasing her, floating between me and her, and having no will, no consciousness, indeed, no life of her own. The child knew nothing. I had done nothing to her." With solipsism in its most basic form being the metaphysical concept that the self can be all that is known to exist, that everything outside of you is simply your perception, there is no independent reality. And this philosophically serves as the crux of Humbert's abuse. It's literally in the name of the text, Lolita. He is the only person who calls Dolores Lolita, and he uses it when he's describing his fantasies of her. He does not respect her as an independent human. He literally views her as a reincarnated Annabelle, and he projects that fantasy onto her as though she were a blank canvas. And this notion, as it relates to abuse, is described in Lana's song Smarty off of her first album through the lines, "Baby, if you love me, you'll call me a bunny. Tell me I'm just a baby, honey. Beat me and tell me that no one will love me better than you do. Say I make you feel like you did when you were 13. With not only the recreation of being 13 a reference to Annabelle, but the bunny lyric as well, as when Humbert describes how he and Annabelle used to discuss, quote, solipsism and so on, the softness and fragility of baby animals caused us the same intense pain. With the disconnect between being beaten and being told that no one will love me better than you do, a direct representation of how Humbert's abuse works. He's unable to distinguish his internalized feelings from his externalized abuse. And to use a less metaphysical and more kind of practical, though less perfect representation of this is, for instance, how controlling partners or parents who view other people as extensions of themselves or tools for their own desires view people and are able to abuse people without even being aware of it because they're unable to see other people as being separate from themselves. And to solidify the symbolic loss of innocence, Humbert then tries to recall to his best ability the real lyrics to the song Carmen, which are, "Oh my Carmen, my little Carmen, something something those something nights, and the stars and the cars and the bars and the barmen. And oh my charming, our dreadful fights, and the something town where so gaily, arm in arm we went, and our final row, and the gun I killed you with, oh my Carmen, the gun I am holding now." Drew his .32 automatic, I guess, and put a bullet through his mole's eye. With Mole being a prostitute, hence the lines in Lana's Carmen, "You don't want to get this way, street walk at night and a star by day. I'm dying, I'm dying." And now that we have established the initial Paradise Lost framework as it relates to the setup of Lolita, we can now explore it as the origin story for Lana del Rey herself in her short film Tropico for Born to Die Paradise Edition, which begins in the Garden of Eden, where Lana is tempted by the serpent and eats the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, despite the punishment for doing so being death. And the motivation for gaining this knowledge despite punishment is succinctly described in her song Pawn Shop Blues off her first album, quote, "In the name of higher consciousness, I let the best man I knew go. 'Cause it's nice to love and be loved, but it's better to know all you can know. Said it's nice to love and be loved, but I'd rather know what God knows." Adam then eats the fruit after Eve in both Paradise Lost and Tropico, causing both of them to face God's punishment of mortality. This origin story for the Born to Die album is described in the short film when Lana says, "And so, from being created in his likeness to being banished for wanting to be too much like him, we were cast out, and the Garden of Eden transformed into the Garden of Evil. Los Angeles, the city of angels, a land of gods and monsters. The in-between realm where only the choices made from your free will decide your soul's final fate. Some poets called it the entrance to the underworld, but on some summer nights, it could feel like paradise. Paradise Lost." And so to begin our deep dive into the metaphysical concepts of mortality and the fate versus free will distinction in Lolita and Lana del Rey, it's best to do so by first exploring their shared backdrop when it comes to time and consciousness and how that's represented in the respective art. And so with that, let's go into the garden and talk about the immortality that us humans lost, shall we? Part 2. Burnt Notion Interlude. In Paradise Lost, even though God knows in advance that Adam, Eve, and Satan would eventually betray him due to his omniscience, he still feels justified in punishing them, saying that their actions were still born of their own free will. And this tension between God knowing our outcome in advance, alongside the idea that we as humans have free will and decision-making in the moment, has been the source of a lot of tension philosophically within Christianity. And I think the best way to understand both of these things existing at the same time is by understanding mortal concepts and notions of time. And so, while God lives outside human perception and can therefore experience all of time as it is in its eternity, all of it existing all at the same time, man's limited consciousness allows only for a stored past and the knowledge of an eventually storable future, which one could call fate. But we all know you can't actually know your fate until the moment of death. But the idea that the soul lives on and that immortality and time are ever present, this guides our choices based on what we've learned from the past towards a desired fate or outcome. And this, of course, in Christianity is what guides our moral decisions. And Lana del Rey shows a sophisticated understanding of this notion, not only through her quote in Tropico, where she describes the fallen world as the in-between realm where only the choices made from your free will decide your soul's final fate, but also through her recitation of T.S. Eliot's poem Burnt Notion on her album Honeymoon, one of her other most highly religiously referential albums. She recites the beginning of the poem to a meditative soundscape, saying, "Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden." Here, Lana describes time as eternal and therefore unredeemable, meaning we have no control or possession over it and no ability to stop it. And all that could have been exists as mere abstraction and speculation because, due to the eternity of time, everything has already happened. And to continue with some unsung but relevant passages from the poem to help highlight this idea, T.S. Eliot writes, "Yet the enchainment of past and future, woven in the weakness of the changing body, protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure." This refers to physical mortality, being chained by flesh within that ever-present chain of eternal time, having a very limited scope and consciousness of what we can experience before our souls return to that eternity. Continuing on, "Time past and time future allow but a little consciousness. To be conscious is not to be in time, but only in time can the moment in the rose garden, the moment in the arbor where the rain beat, the moment in the draughty church at Smokefall be remembered, involved with past and future. Only through time, time is conquered." And so here, memory is how we capture or conquer time, giving it a spatial beginning and end, being aware of that spatial boundary, and being able to remove yourself from the present in order to experience snippets of time as if they are happening. This not only makes us feel godlike in a sense, but also contains a kiss of death, because it reminds us that our capacity to store memory is limited. We don't get infinite memory, and indulging in memory in the mortal world also, again, requires giving up present consciousness. You're robbing yourself of time by reliving the past. And this is why Humbert in Lolita refers to Mnemosyne, or memory, as the sweetest and most mischievous of muses, publishing an essay called Mimir and Memory, where "I suggested, among other things that seemed original and important to that splendid review's benevolent readers, a theory of perceptual time based on the circulation of the blood, and conceptually depending on the mind's being conscious not only of matter, but also of its own self, thus creating a continuous spanning of 2 points, the storable future and the stored past." And so, while God punishes man through physical mortality, he also punishes us through awareness of that mortality, which also, again, influences our moral choices when we're aware of the eternity of a soul and the possibility of heaven or hell. And this concept of time as the mortal experience is explored further by Nabokov himself in an interview with Playboy, where he's reading off some of his notes that say, "Time without consciousness, lower animal world. Time with consciousness, man. Consciousness without time, some still higher state." And the closest feeling we can achieve to immortality on Earth, or that feeling of consciousness without time, is by being completely in the present moment. T.S. Eliot kind of highlights this idea in his poem, saying, "I can only say there we have been, but I cannot say where, and I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. The inner freedom from the practical desire, the release from action and suffering, release from the inner and the outer compulsion, yet surrounded by a grace of sense, a white light still and moving, erubung without motion, concentration without elimination, both the new world and the old made explicit, understood in the completion of its partial ecstasy, the resolution of its partial horror." And this state of not perceiving time even as we physically pass through it, in secular terms, is referred to as the flow state, and is also often the goal of meditation. I think we've all been lost before in projects or activities in which 2 hours may as well be 20 hours, or 5 minutes feels like an hour, or an hour feels like 5 minutes. This is also kind of the way children tend to experience time. And so when it comes to loss of innocence in literature and the humanities, it's the replacement of that childlike presence with the awareness of death that then results in persistent anxiety. And this trading of immortality with awareness of death is, of course, the crux of Lana's philosophy and her art-making process, and the major themes in her work. Being set up with Humbert's initial fall from paradise, immortality serves as one of the largest themes in Lolita as well, with his conception of nymphets being a stand-in for what he felt before losing his innocence through Annabelle's death. This immortality metaphor is developed through his assertion that a significant age gap is necessary, quote, to come under a nymphet's spell, for when I was a child and she was a child, my little Annabelle was no nymphet to me. I was her equal, a faunlet in my own right, on that same enchanted island of time. Humbert also describes the pleasure of watching nymphets play hopscotch and jump rope from a park bench, saying, "Leave me alone in my pubescent park, in my mossy garden. Let them play around me forever. Never grow up." With the term nymphet also being a direct reference to Greek mythology, where nymphs are immortal deities tied to nature, much as Dolores grows up near the aptly named Hourglass Lake. And moving from immortality back to the fate versus free will distinction, we see choice play a further theme within the plot when Dolores kisses Humbert before going off to summer camp, which he describes in these terms. "My Lolita, who was half in and about to slam the car door, interrupted the motion of fate. She looked up and dashed back into the house, Hayes furiously calling after her. A moment later, I heard my sweetheart running up the stairs. My heart expanded with such force that it almost blotted me out. I hitched up the pants of my pajamas, flung the door open, and simultaneously Lolita arrived in her Sunday frock, stamping, panting, and then she was in my arms, her innocent mouth melting under the ferocious pressure of dark male jaws, my palpitating darling. The next instant I heard her, alive, unraped, clatter downstairs. The motion of fate was resumed." The maid then hands Humbert a letter written by Charlotte in which she confesses that she is in love with him. Realizing he can marry her and become Dolores' father, therefore being able to do whatever he pleases with her, he describes the infinity of his choices by saying, "In a word, before such an amazing offer, before such a vastness and variety of vistas, I was as helpless as Adam at the preview of early Oriental history, miraged in his apple orchard." And after marrying Dolores' mother and waiting for the child to return from camp, Charlotte tells Humbert that she is, in fact, going to send Dolores straight to boarding school afterwards, so she no longer has to deal with her. Humbert wrestles with his moral conscience, wanting to drown her in Hourglass Lake, but is unable to do it, saying, "No man can bring about the perfect murder. Chance, however, can do it." And after Charlotte finds Humbert's diary, she runs out of the house in a panic and is struck dead by a car. Humbert says, quote, "The numbness of my soul was for a moment resolved, and no wonder. I had actually seen the agent of fate. I had palpated the very flesh of fate and its padded shoulder. A brilliant and monstrous mutation had suddenly taken place, and here was the instrument. Within the intricacies of the pattern, I could dimly distinguish my own vile contribution. Had I not been such a fool, or such an intuitive genius, to preserve that journal, fluids produced by vindictive anger and hot shame would not have blinded Charlotte in her dash to the mailbox. But even had they blinded her, still nothing might have happened had not precise fate, that synchronizing phantom, mixed within its alembic the car and the dog and the sun and the shade and the wet and the weak and the strong and the stone. That fate's formal handshake brought me out of my torpor, and I wept. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I wept." And there is a lot to unpack in this passage, but to begin with the Arachne metaphor, Humbert views his contribution to that of fate as being equal, again with the comparison to the gods and the hubris at this point in the story, and recognizing where his fate is headed if he chooses to act on his free will. We get a highly religious reference with Humbert wept, similarly to the Book of John, in which Jesus weeps upon recognizing the imminence of his sacrificial fate. He then goes to the garden to pray to God for 3 times, initially asking God to spare him of his fate, and then ultimately submitting to God's will, again highlighting the notion of choice in the story in the Book of John. And Lana also references these 3 prayers in the garden from the Bible in her song Coachella Woodstock in My Mind, where she sings, "What about all these children and all their children's children? And what about all the crowns they wear and hair so long like mine? And what about all their wishes, wrapped up like garland roses? Around their little heads, I said a prayer for a 3rd time. I'd trade it all for a stairway to heaven. I'd take my time for the climb up to the top of it. I'd trade the fame and the fortune and the legend. I'd give it all away if you give me just one day to ask him one question." Ending with, "Got a million things I want to say, like what's it all for, will it be okay? Million things I want to say, like what's it all for?" With this song also referencing the ever-presence of time because she's at Coachella, but in her mind it's Woodstock because art and life are all existing at once. This is further explained also in the preceding song off of that album, Love, through the lines, "Look at you kids with your vintage music, coming through satellites while cruising. You're part of the past, but now you're the future. Signals crossing can get confusing. It's enough just to make you feel crazy." With her music and art making being her attempt to get back the immortality that she lost as a result of God's punishment. This is a huge theme, not just in this video, but throughout all of her discography, and so I will be exploring more of that later on. But the lyrics also of being willing to trade all of her wealth and fame for the knowledge of what will happen to man and, being able to ask God questions and so on. This also to me highlights just how much Lana's art making is driven more by metaphysical inquiry than it is by fame or fortune. But going back to Humbert weeping, he also describes coming out of torpor and into a state of action as a result of Fat Fate's formal handshake, and remarks that the red sun of desire and decision are the 2 things that create a live world, and decides he should fulfill his fantasy knowing, quote, "She would not be forever Lolita, and that the word forever referred only to my own passion, to the eternal Lolita as reflected in my blood. Perhaps wanting to experience and therefore store as many memories of, quote, the Lolita that today I could touch and smell and hear and see, as that Lolita, my Lolita, poor Catalyst would lose forever." Emphasizing that just like the Roman poet that he is referring to, he only has a limited time to capture that ephemeral quality of Lolita as she exists now before her nymphetry ends, recognizing and realizing that only through memory or writing can he immortalize that version of her before losing her forever. And just as T.S. Eliot writes that only through time is conquered, we have to first consciously experience the present in order to gain future memories that we can then store and rely upon and take with us when our soul reunites with God. And this concept of memory not only existing in mortal notions of time, but being a part of that ever-present chain of eternal time that exists outside of us, Lana sings in her song The Grants, quote, "Do you think about heaven? Do you think about me? My pastor told me, when you leave, all you take is your memory. I'm going to take mine of you with me." And so, deciding to live in time and chase his desires, even as he catches a glimpse of what his ultimate fate for doing so might be, Humbert decides that in order to immortalize this memory of Lolita, of Dolores, he has to live in time in order to then get and store those memories that will keep him comfort later on. And with that, he decides to tell Dolores not that her mother is dead, but that she is merely sick and that they have to visit her in a hospital out of town. He goes to camp to pick her up, and we are off to the races. Part 3. Off to the races. And we're off to the races, places, ready set the gate is, down and now we're going in. Picking Dolores up from camp while she's still in her schoolgirl crush phase, she teases that Humbert, her now stepfather, no longer cares for her now that he married her mom. He stops the car and this scene plays out. Hardly had the car come to a standstill than Lolita positively flowed into my arms. Not daring let myself go, not even daring let myself realize that this, sweet wetness and trembling fire, was the beginning of the ineffable life which, ably assisted by fate, I had finally willed into being. Not daring really kiss her, I touched her hot, opening lips with the utmost piety. Tiny sips, nothing salacious. But she, with an impatient wriggle, pressed her mouth to mine so hard that I felt her big front teeth and shared in the peppermint taste of her saliva. With this scene referenced in Lana's Cherry, where the background vocals are, "Can I get a fucking hallelujah, working on you like I'm back in school. Can I get a fucking hallelujah, sipping on you like a Coca-Cola." With schoolgirl Dolores still feeling like she is in control of her pursuance of him, and references to the tiny sips that he takes. The psychology of this pre-raped Dolores is furthered in Off to the Races through the lyrics, "I'm your little scarlet starlet, singing in the garden, kiss me on my open mouth, ready for you." With Dolores being described both as a starlet and having lips painted scarlet throughout the text, and her still being in the garden before the banishment that comes with the loss of her innocence. Which I think it's important to mention at this point in the video as well. There is some time between when Eve first eats the apple and when she is banished from paradise in Paradise Lost, as well as the Genesis story. I kind of jumped the gun a little bit to explain the fate-free will distinction and time and consciousness and so on, but this is the beginning when Adam and Eve are overcome with lust and feelings of power, not yet aware of the mortality that is to come. And we actually see this turn in Tropico when Lana first eats the fruit. She's singing her song Body Electric, which is named after the Walt Whitman poem of the same name. And she goes on to recite the Whitman poem in her video, which is a worshipping of the flesh that ends with the lines, "Oh, I say, these are not the parts and poems of the body only, but of the soul. Oh, I say now, these are the soul." Signifying the turn away from God and spiritual worship into the worship of the flesh. And this is reflected further in Lana's song of the same name with the lines, "Mary prays the rosary for my broken mind. I said don't worry about it, I sing the body electric." And at this point of the story as well, the desire line of Dolores Hayes is actually parallel to that of Humbert Humbert. As we know, Humbert is trying to regain the love he lost through the death of Annabelle, but it is set up through context clues throughout the novel that Dolores is trying to regain the lost love of her father, who had already died when she was young, because that's the only love that she's known up to this point because her mother kind of hates her. Dolores' father is described as, quote, "the sublime, purified, analyzed, deified Harold Hayes," notably the other HH, with Humbert also now taking the place of her father and kind of blurring the lines between sexual and father-daughter roles within their dynamic. There's also references to justifications for incest throughout the novel, with Humbert telling Dolores that it's totally normal for girls to sleep with their dads, and so on. And to highlight this motivation through Lana's song Textbook, we get the lyrics, "I guess you could call it textbook. I was looking for the father I wanted back. And then there was the issue of her. I didn't even like myself or love the life that I had. And there you were with shining stars, standing blue with open arms. You touched a detriment most of the friends I knew already had." And sure enough, when Dolores sees her friends have loving relationships with their fathers, it pains her greatly. And we also see elements of the Electra complex set up throughout the novel as well. There is even a character specifically named Electra, with Dolores and her mother being in sexual competition with each other over Humbert Humbert, as well as frequent references to psychotherapy throughout the text. And upon entrance to the Enchanted Hunter's Hotel, when Dolores sees that they are to be sharing the same bed, she says, "You are crazy," said Lo. "Why, my darling?" "Because, my darling, when darling mother finds out, she'll divorce you and strangle me." With this element of competition furthered in Lana's unreleased song My Mama, with the lines, "Me and my mama, we don't get along. My mama, she would love you like I love you, if she ever met you, if she ever knew. My mama, she would fall right on top of you, if she ever saw you, she'd be smitten too. I'll never take you home, I want you all for my own. Don't let my mama hear your pretty song. I'm gonna take you on, I don't feel like it's wrong. Me and my mama, we don't get along." Humbert then explains to Lo that they might have to share a lot of beds together, which Dolores calls out as being incest, and then to distract her from what is happening, he tells her to open up his suitcase, which is full of gorgeous clothes that he bought for the child. And it's here I want to talk about Lana's song Lolita off of Born to Die, which was heavily accused of romanticizing Lolita and kind of criticized for that. I don't think it's a romanticization. I think it's a pretty accurate snippet of Dolores at this stage of her grooming, where she is being distracted with fanciful objects from the inappropriateness of her situation. To read some lyrics from that song, "Look at what I bought, not a second thought, oh Romeo. I want my cake and I want to eat it too. I want to have fun and be in love with you. I know that I'm a mess with my long hair and my suntan short dress bare feet. I don't care what they say about me, because I know that it's LOVE. You make me happy, and I never listen to anyone anyway." And to me, the explicit reference to Shakespeare's Romeo both highlights the childlike naivete of Dolores at this time, as well as foreshadowing the tragedy that is to come. With not listening to anyone, both a reference to Romeo, where all of society, morality, any caring guardian would warn against what Dolores is about to enter into, but she doesn't care because it's the first happiness she's felt in a long time, as well as a reference to not listening to her mother, who had previously lied in order to hurt her, in a contrasting scene about clothing. Quote, "Hayes, with a dreary laugh, said she had told Lo that her beloved Humbert thoroughly approved of the whole camp idea, and now," added Hayes, "the child throws a fit. Pretext, you and I want to get rid of her. Actual reason? I told her we would exchange tomorrow for plainer stuff, some much too cute night things that she bullied me into buying for her. You see, she sees herself as a starlet. I see her as a sturdy, healthy, but decidedly homely kid. This, I guess, is at the root of our troubles." And you can see now that at this point in the text, Dolores realizes that Humbert is not abandoning her for camp, he's actually rescuing her from camp, and he sees her as the starlet she sees herself as, versus her mother's view of her, which is as generally worthless. And so this, of course, reinforces to her that it's LOVE, that he makes her happy. She wants so badly for this to be true that she's finally getting the love that she had lost so long ago. And of course, this also heightens the Electra complex in that she is now more motivated to get back at her mother by pursuing her now stepfather. And to be clear, Lana's song Lolita is uncomfortable, and it's meant to be. The spelling out of the lyrics like a childhood game, references to kissing fruit punch lips in the park and skipping rope, force us to contend with Dolores as a 12-year-old grooming victim she is in the book, rather than as the aged-up femme fatale she's portrayed as in the movies, unaware that she's about to face a great tragedy. And going back to the biblical references, we see Dolores being tempted by these items through the line. "Then, while I stood waiting for her, she pulled out the slow snake of a brilliant belt and tried it on." And much as Lolita in the song refuses to listen to anyone else's warning, just as Eve does in Paradise Lost before eating the apple, we see her initially seeking out her own loss of innocence in the song Gods and Monsters through the lyrics, "Motel sprees, and I'm singing. Fuck yeah, give it to me. This is heaven, what I truly want. It's innocence lost." And so while here in the story, we see the apex of Dolores' desire to lose her own innocence in hopes of regaining the love that she had lost and to get back at her mother, we then see Humbert wrestle with his own sense of morality and decision when Dolores goes to sleep and he exits the hotel room. Stepping outside, he is addressed by a voice asking him where he got Dolores, asking where her mother is, and saying he knows she isn't his daughter. Each time, though, Humbert asks him to repeat what he is saying, to which he makes normal statements like, "July is hot." As readers, we can brush this off as Humbert's paranoia, but as a flicker of light illuminates an old man's face, we are reminded of the Arachne metaphor, in which Athena takes the form of an old woman to warn Arachne not to continue with her comparisons with the gods, and to ask forgiveness while there is still time. But, eschewing this warning, quote, "Nobody said anything, and the darkness returned to its initial place. Then I heard the old-timer cough and deliver himself of some sepulchral mucus," with sepulchral meaning gloomy or related to a tomb, further highlighting this as a warning. This warning is then furthered by Humbert's admission to the jury that, quote, "I should have known, by the signs made to me by something in Lolita, the real child Lolita, or by some haggard angel behind her back, that nothing but pain and horror would result from the expected rapture." O winged gentlemen of the jury! With the gravity of Humbert's choice emphasized through spiritual imagery as he re-enters the hotel, quote, "I wandered through various public rooms, glory below, gloom above. For the look of lust is always gloomy. Lust is never quite sure, even when the velvety victim is locked up in one's dungeon, that some rival devil or influential god may still not abolish one's prepared triumph. I drifted to the men's room. There, a person in the clerical black inquired me of how I had liked Dr. Boyd's talk," referring to a religious convention that was being held at the hotel. And what's so fascinating about this imagery to me is that it is a reversal of the great chain of being, Instead of heaven being on top that one would ascend to, it is reversed, it's below, with this paradise of hell flames or hell above that Humbert then chooses to ascend towards. He states, I again chose the stairs. 342 was near the fire escape. One could still, but the key was already in the lock, and then I was in the room. With the stairway now being a stairway to hell rather than heaven, with the fire escape being the alternate staircase, the footfall and the echo, if you will, that he did not take in order to escape his fate at that point. And to further this beginning of Humbert's inner conflict between lust and morality, he states, Jurors, if my happiness could have talked, it would have filled that genteel hotel with a deafening roar. And my only regret today is that I did not quietly deposit key 342 at the office and leave the town, the country, the continent, the hemisphere, indeed the globe, that very same night. And so, as a result of his grooming, we get this scene in the morning. I had thought that months, perhaps years would elapse before I dared to reveal myself to Dolores Hayes. But by 6 she was wide awake, and by 6:15 we were technically lovers. I'm going to tell you something very strange. It was she who seduced me. And how does this happen? Dolores suggests to Humbert that they play a game she learned at camp, where she had lost her virginity with a boy her age, while Humbert pretends not to know what sex is and plays aloof. And this scene is represented in Lana's unreleased song Hollywood's Dead through the lyrics. This kind of life wasn't meant for the good girl. Try as I might, in the end, it's a cruel world. And you are live-in proof, Sinatra aloof, but you are an actor who only went after the ones who swooned. And with the fulfillment of both characters' fantasies at this point in the novel, they very quickly both enter into the cruel world mentioned in the song as they step back into the car out of the hotel, and Humbert remarks, Cold spiders of panic crawled down my back. This was an orphan. This was a lone child, an absolute waif, with whom a heavy-limbed, foul-smelling adult had had strenuous intercourse 3 times that very morning. Whether or not the realization of a lifelong dream had surpassed all expectation, it had, in a sense, overshot its mark and plunged into a nightmare. I had been careless, stupid, and ignoble. And let me be quite frank. Somewhere at the bottom of that dark turmoil, I felt the writhing of desire again. So monstrous was my appetite for that miserable nymphet. And this is exactly what happens in Paradise Lost after Adam and Eve eat the fruit and fuck each other out of God's sight. Milton writes, Covered, but not at rest or ease of mind, they sat them down to weep. Nor only tears rained at their eyes, but high winds worse within began to rise. High passions, anger, hate, mistrust, suspicion, discord, and shook sore their inward state of mind, calm region once and full of peace, now tossed and turbulent. For understanding ruled not, and the will heard not her lore, both in subjection now to sensual appetite, who, from beneath usurping over sovereign reason, claimed superior sway. With this cycle of the heaven of fondling nymphet burning off to reveal the sin and nightmare underneath in a perpetual cycle, highlighted in Lana's song Cherry through the lines. A touch from your real love is like heaven taking the place of something evil and letting it burn off from the rush. This same cycle is described later on in the book with Humbert's reflection that, I recall certain moments, let us call them icebergs in paradise, and after having had my fill of her, I would gather her in my arms with, at last, a mute moan of human tenderness, and the tenderness would deepen to shame and despair, and I would lull and rock my lone light Lolita in my marble arms, and caress her at random and mutely ask her blessing. And at the peak of this human, agonized, selfless tenderness, with my soul actually hanging around her naked body and ready to repent, all at once, ironically, horribly, lust would swell again and, oh no, Lolita would say with a sigh to heaven. And the next moment, the tenderness and the azure, all would be shattered. And for Dolores, the ultimate turn from fantasy to nightmare occurs when she asks to call her mother from a gas station, and Humbert tells her that her mother is dead. He then describes all kinds of items he tries to buy to cheer her up, ending with, At the hotel we had separate rooms, but in the middle of the night she came sobbing into mine, and we made it up very gently. You see, she had absolutely nowhere else to go. With the ultimate death of Dolores' innocence represented through the line, it was something quite special, that feeling. An oppressive, hideous constraint, as if I were sitting with the small ghost of somebody I had just killed. And in Paradise Lost, this replacement of innocence with the knowledge of good and evil is described with the lines, Soon found their eyes how opened, and their minds how darkened. Innocence, that as a veil had shadowed them from knowing ill, was gone. with Lana's titular track Born to Die literally being about this scene with the lines, "I can see that once I was blind, 'cause you and I, we were born to die." And her entrance into the fallen world described in Gods and Monsters with the lyrics, "In the land of gods and monsters, I was an angel, living in the garden of evil, screwed up, scared, doing anything that I needed, shining like a fiery beacon." With this banishment recognized by Dolores when Humbert wants to take her through a magnolia garden because the ad says, quote, "Oh reader, my reader, guess, because children, and by jingo was not my Lolita a child, will walk starry-eyed and reverently through this foretaste of heaven, drinking in beauty that can influence a life." "Not mine," said Grimlow, and settled down on a bench with the fillings of 2 Sunday papers in her lovely lap. And mentioned in Lana's Blue Banisters in reference to Milton describing paradise as an eternal spring, quote, "There were flowers that were dry, sitting on the dresser. She asked me where they're from, I said a place I don't remember. Summer comes, winter goes, spring I skip, God knows. Summer comes, winter goes, spring I sleep, heaven knows." Humbert, however, as the ruler over Dolores in this fallen world, states, "I still dwell deep in my elected paradise. A paradise whose skies were the color of hell flames, but still a paradise." Referring to Satan's most famous line in Milton's poem, quote, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." And echoed in Lana's unreleased track Velvet Crowbar with the lines, "Flame-colored paradise for you, darling, but death doesn't come with a warning." And with this recognition of her changed fate, we also get a callback to T.S. Eliot's Burnt Notion through Lana's lines in Cherry, quote, "My rose garden dreams set on fire by fiends," referring to when Humbert heard the unraped Dolores clatter downstairs, just as the poem states, "Footfalls echo in the memory down the passage we did not take, towards a door we never opened, into the rose garden." With that unabused, unraped Dolores existing as a mere abstraction and speculation, because the reality is that Dolores now is being abused kind of forever. And with fantasy turned to nightmare, the closest thing Dolores has as a form of escape to regain that subconscious drive from the beginning is through going to picture shows, with her favorites being musicals where, quote, "Real singers and dancers had unreal stage careers in an essentially grief-proof sphere of existence where from death and truth were banned, and where, at the end, white-haired, dewy-eyed, technically deathless, the initially reluctant father of a show-crazy girl always finished by applauding her apotheosis on fabulous Broadway." And after a year-long road trip full of abuse and tears, they finally arrive in the town of Beardsley, where Humbert puts his daughter in school. And we can track the plotline of this section by seeing how the refrain in Lana's song Off to the Races, which is the same as the opening line of Lolita, changes. She first sings, "Light of my life, fire of my loins, be a good baby, do what I want," with this being Humbert's perspective with his description of her, as he tells her to be good and command his orders. Then we get, "Light of his life, fire of his loins, keep me forever, tell me you own me," from Dolores' perspective as she is controlled and owned by him. "Light of your life, fire of your loins, tell me you own me, give me them coins," with this referring to her trying to gain power in the dynamic by exchanging sexual favors for money, which she does when they arrive in Beardsley. Rummaging through her room and stealing his coins back so she can't run away, however, we get the lyrics, "My old man is a thief, and I'm gonna stay and pray with him till the end. I'm not afraid to say that I'd die without him. Who else is gonna put up with me this way?" And while in the text Dolores does eventually find a way to escape the situation, she is initially more afraid of dying or being sent off somewhere worse, which is why she doesn't rat on Humbert. We see this through Humbert's threats to Dolores on their trip that if she turns him in, quote, "While I stand gripping the bars, you, happy neglected child, will be given a choice of various dwelling places, all more or less the same. The correctional school, the reformatory, the juvenile detention home, or one of those admirable girls' protectories where you knit things and sing hymns and have rancid pancakes on Sundays. If we two are found out, you will be analyzed and institutionalized, my pet. This is a situation, this is the choice. Don't you think that under the circumstances, Dolores Hayes had better stick to her old man? By rubbing all this in, I succeeded in terrorizing Lo, causing her, when interacting with the police, to be, quote, more afraid of the law than I." And so, through the lyrics, "Who else is going to put up with me this way? I need you, I breathe you, I'd never leave you," this is essentially the terrorized Lo telling Humbert exactly what he wants her to say. And when it comes to the fear of death preventing her from escaping, we also get the lines from Humbert, I have still other smothered memories, now unfolding themselves into limbless monsters of pain. Once, in a sunset-ending street of Beardsley, she turned to little Eva Rosen, and so very serenely and seriously, in answer to something the other had said about its being better to die than hear Milton Pinsky, some local schoolboy she knew, talk about music, my Lolita remarked, "You know, what's so dreadful about dying is that you are completely on your own." With some pretty direct Paradise Lost references yet again, with Eva Rosen sounding like Eve and Roses, and Milton being the name of the poet. And in that poem, Eve is terrified of dying alone, saying, "With him all deaths I could endure, without him live no life." And this is why Lana ends off to the races that way. It's reference to Paradise Lost and Dolores' psychology at this time. And of course, while this song heavily references Lolita, the lyrics in full are clearly about an adult alcoholic party girl and her sugar daddy, with the references used to symbolize the power imbalance of the relationship and probably also some abuse, as much of Lana's writing is about her personal experiences with abuse, which we'll get into more fully in the psychology section. And with Dolores initially feeling like she has no choice in the matter, we get this line from her unreleased song, Tired of Singing the Blues, through the lyrics. "Man who makes a beast out of himself's got nothing to lose. Sold my soul long ago, nothing left to choose." Enrolling in a school play called The Enchanted Hunters, however, Dolores learns to deceive Humbert through acting and also finds a better hiding spot for her coins that he never finds out. And while the play, having the same name as the hotel in which Humbert was warned by Arachne and where the first rape took place, that will be a meta-narrative going on throughout this video. But to continue the Arachne metaphor here, Humbert first notices that his fate is about to change through this line. "One of the latticed squares in a small cobwebby casement window at the turn of the staircase was glazed with ruby, and that raw wound among the unstained rectangles and its asymmetrical position, a knight's move from the top, always strangely disturbed me." This being a callback to Humbert's silk web of control that turns to cobwebs when Dolores is out of his control, as well as him being Humbert the Wounded Spider when she's talking to Kenneth Knight, hence the same knight name, as well as, of course, this being a reference to chess, in which the knight moves in an L position, signifying he's about to lose Lolita, and it coming from the top because it is the gods or deities who are about to punish Arachne for comparing himself to the gods. And yes, I read this novel way too many times in preparation for this video. That's like the most English teacher thing I have ever explained. And one of the promotional images from Lana for her song Lolita deals directly to the scene in which Humbert first realizes that Dolores is deceiving him. Quote, "So downstairs I went, clearing my throat and holding my heart. Lo is now in the living room, in her favorite overstuffed chair. As she sprawled there, biting at a hangnail and mocking me with her heartless, vaporous eyes, I perceived all at once, with a sickening qualm, just how much she had changed since I first met her 2 years ago. Or had this happened during those last 2 weeks? She sat right in the focus of my incandescent anger. The fog of all lust had been swept away, leaving nothing but this dreadful lucidity. Oh, she had changed." And after they get into a huge fight, where Dolores accuses him of having killed her mother, she runs out into a storm and makes a call from a payphone. When Humbert catches up to her, she asks him to take her out of school and for them to go on yet another road trip. But, quote, "This time we'll go wherever I want, won't we?" To which he agrees. And for the third and final time in the text, we see Dolores initiate sex with Humbert, the first time when she's a schoolgirl, the second time when her mother is dead and she's all alone, and this time when she has a secret plan for leaving him. She says, "Carry me upstairs, please. I feel sort of romantic tonight." With this scene explicitly referenced in Lana's unreleased track 1949, which takes place in the year that this happens when Dolores is 14. The lines are, "Carry me up them stairs with my white socks on and my blonde hair long. You like my pin-up bodice and the solace that comes with the midnight air and my icy stare." With a final road trip referred to in the lines, "We're gonna party like it's 1949. We're in the Pontiac from July to July. Gonna see it all before he says goodbye. Gonna party like it's 1949. And escaping the town of Beardsley and being back on the road again, we see Dolores' plan unfold in our next section, Put Me in a Movie. Part 4. Put Me in a Movie. With our two characters back on the road again, Humbert very quickly notices that their blue sedan is being followed by an Aztec red convertible. The scene plays out like this. Nobody attempted to get in between our humble blue car and its imperious red shadow. The driver behind me looked like a display dummy, and his convertible seemed to move only because an invisible rope of silent silk connected it with our shabby vehicle. We were many times weaker than his splendid, lacquered machine, and all the time I was aware of a private blaze on my right, her joyful eye, her flaming cheek. And here we're back to the Arachne weaving metaphor from the beginning, but this time instead of Dolores being in Humbert's web of control, they're both in another driver's web of control, with Dolores seeming to be happy about it. And while Humbert had first, quote, put the geography of the United States into motion across the crazy quilt of 48 states, that quilt is now being put into motion by their follower, who Humbert describes as a veritable Proteus of the highway. With bewildering ease, he switched from one vehicle to another, with Proteus being a shape-shifting sea god who answers only to those capable of capturing him. Proteus is also referenced at the beginning of the novel as the Old Man of the Sea, his title in Homer's Odyssey, as the one who interrupts him just as he is about to consummate his love with Annabelle. And this is also similar to the content of Arachne's woven tapestry, which depicts the gods, and in particular Zeus, changing form in order to manipulate women. In stopping at a gas station to buy sunglasses, Dolores talks to the driver as though they know each other, and refuses to tell Humbert his identity upon interrogation. She later denies knowing him again, and then seeing that Dolores had erased the car's license plate number he'd written down, he slaps her and then cries, asking for her forgiveness, further symbolizing his loss of control. Humbert then tells us that, in the velvet night, I kissed the yellowish soles of her long-toed feet. I immolated myself, but it was all of no avail. Both doomed were we, and soon I was to enter a new cycle of persecution. With this biblically laden passage further symbolizing that Humbert's fate is about to close in on him, and that his time is almost up. And so, finally, when Dolores stays overnight at a hospital with a fever, Humbert calls the hospital in the morning to learn that she was checked out by a man claiming to be her uncle, which we know is false because she has no living relatives. This begins 3 years of mournful separation for Humbert. He really devolves into madness at this point. It's a little bit disturbing to read. He's in and out of sanatoriums, and he describes it as such. There would be little sense in analyzing the 3 empty years that followed. While a few pertinent points have to be marked, the general impression I desire to convey is of a side door crashing open in life's full flight, and a rush of roaring black time drowning with its whipping wind the cry of lone disaster. With this sense of losing his paradise again and being thrust into this eternal black time rather than the heaven that he had sought out before, this chaos finally comes to an end when he receives a letter from Dolores, who is 17, pregnant, married, and asking him for money. He finds where she lives and describes her appearance, saying, "There she was, my Lolita, hopelessly worn at 17, with that baby, dreaming already in her of becoming a big shot and retiring around 2020 AD. And I looked and looked at her, and I knew as clearly as I know I am to die, that I loved her more than anything I had ever seen or imagined on earth, or hoped for anywhere else." And calls her his Carmen a few more times throughout this scene, similar to Lana's song, where Carmen is, quote, only 17, with further lyrics, "You don't want to be like me, don't want to see all the things I've seen," of which we will get to in a moment, but first I want to highlight this being the end of Humbert's solipsism. He first experiences it upon his separation, but now seeing Dolores as an older woman, 17-year-old, no longer a nymphet, he describes losing this fantasy version of her to the sad reality underneath, saying, "What I used to pamper among the tangled vines of my heart, my great radiant sin, had dwindled to its essence, sterile and selfish vice, all that I canceled and cursed." And this sense of sin is also alluded to during their separation in this scene where he tells us that, under the guidance of an intelligent French-speaking confessor, to whom, in a moment of metaphysical curiosity, I had turned over a Protestant's drab atheism for an old-fashioned popish cure, I had hoped to deduce from my sense of sin the existence of a supreme being. The good priest worked on me with the finest tenderness and understanding. Alas, I was unable to transcend the simple human fact that whatever spiritual solace I might find, whatever lithophanic eternities might be provided for me, nothing could make my Lolita forget the foul lust I had inflicted upon her, unless it can be proven to me that in the infinite run it does not matter a jot that a North American girl child named Dolores Hayes had been deprived of her childhood by a maniac. Unless this can be proven, and if it can, then life is a joke, I see nothing for the treatment of my misery but the melancholy and very local palliative of articulate art. To quote an old poet, "The moral sense in mortals is the duty we have to pay on mortal sense of beauty." Here, Humbert's moral conclusion is that he is not deserving of any afterlife due to what he inflicted upon Dolores, as well as that seeking to corrupt or control mortal, fleeting beauty is not a proper way to gain heaven, and rather than conquering, it's best to admire the forms of beauty and truth, etc., that bring us closer to a higher spiritual realm, which is one of the biggest metaphysical concepts in this entire novel, which is the Platonic view that contemplating and admiring beauty can bring us closer to God, but relies on our recognition of the independence of that beauty as separate from ourselves, which Humbert was incapable of doing when solipsizing Dolores into his fantasies rather than seeing her as a separate person. And to highlight the difference between Humbert's past actions and his moral resolution, I'd like to quote from Plato's Phaedrus, "Now he who has not been lately initiated, or who has become corrupted, is not easily carried out of this world to the sight of absolute beauty in the other. He looks only at that which has the name of beauty in this world, and instead of being awed at the sight of her, like a brutish beast, he rushes on to enjoy and beget. He takes wantonness to his bosom, and is not afraid or ashamed of pursuing pleasure in violation of nature. But he whose initiation is recent, and who has been a spectator of many glories in the other world, is amazed when he sees anyone having a godlike face or form, which is the expression or imitation of divine beauty." And this is developed further in the Neoplatonic belief that man is suspended between mind and matter in this great chain of being, where he can either ascend upwards through the mind to reach a higher level of being, or descend to the animal world of beasts at the lowest level of the chain, which is what we saw a reversal of back in the Enchanted Hunter's Hotel when Humbert chooses to worship his lust. And this moral reckoning that Humbert has causes him to reflect on the proper hierarchy of that spiritual structure, telling us, "Curious, although actually her looks had faded, I definitely realized, so hopelessly late in the day, how much she had always looked, like Botticelli's russet Venus, the same soft nose, the same blurred beauty." And this recognition comes after Venus had been referenced all throughout the text, first with her being in the magazine Dolores is showing him when he pushes it away and we get the Carmen scene, up until most recently, before she goes into the hospital, he calls her a fevered Venus and is overcome with lust for her. And as we follow along with Humbert's subconscious recognition of Dolores' godlike or divine beauty into the conscious recognition of it, it follows the end of his solipsism and his moral reckoning. And this is further an example of Plato's belief of theory of forms, where in Symposium, the character Pausanias argues that while the terrestrial Aphrodite draws man in through lust, the Aphrodite Urania, the version of Venus represented in Botticelli's famous painting, inspires one towards the divine form of celestial or heavenly beauty, with arguments fleshed out later on how while the body may draw you into a piece of art, it's the divine beauty that elevates you to a higher realm. And because there are universal truths in the Platonic view of beauty, truth, love, everything, that is the universal. We and all the other matter on earth are the particulars, and we constantly long to be reunited with that spiritual divine realm. And I'll talk about this idea a lot more in the aesthetic bliss section of this video, but returning to the plot for a moment, when it comes to all of the things that Dolores has seen since Humbert's been gone, Humbert asks who it was she had run off with, and she tells him that it was Claire Quilty, the playwright of the Enchanted Hunters. Because she knew he, quote, liked little girls, unquote, and had been almost jailed for it, Dolores felt comfortable confiding in him about her abuse. Telling her he would give her a role in a movie as a tennis player, he moves her out to California to his ranch, where he then tries to get her to participate in child pornography with a mix of other kids and adults. Very similar to like how we all know Hollywood parties are at this point in time. It's like, truth is stranger than fiction. And this experience Dolores describes with Quilty is directly referenced off of Lana's first album in her song Put Me in a Movie with the lines, "Lights, camera, action. If he likes me, takes me home. Lights, camera, action. You know I can't make it on my own. Come on, you know you like little girls. You can be my daddy. Put me in a movie." And I wish I could play a sample of this song, but anytime you put her first album on the internet, it gets copyright stricken down eventually, so I'll have to describe the tone of her voice when she is singing this. And to describe it, I think it's actually best highlighted through a passage of Humbert's observation of Dolores, where he says, "I saw a look on her face. That look I cannot exactly describe, an expression of helplessness so perfect that it seemed to grade into one of rather comfortable inanity, just because this was the very limit of injustice and frustration, and every limit presupposes something beyond it, hence the neutral illumination." She sings it in like a very hollow, knowing, defeated manner, is what I'm trying to say. But after choosing not to participate in Quilty's films, Dolores is kicked off of the ranch. She becomes a waitress. That's where she then meets her husband, with this change in her choices reflected in paralleled lyrics from High by the Beach, where Lana sings, "Lights, camera, action, I'll do it on my own. Don't need your money to get me what I want." With this emotional shift from a doomed and helpless Dolores into an agent of her own free will, first choosing to escape Humbert and then leaving Claire Quilty, reflected in both the demo and studio versions of Lana's song Lust for Life. The demo version contains these lyrics: "It's funny how some things just change in a day or even in an hour. I'm like a wild caged animal, lying by the swimming pool, losing all my power. It's funny how my life just stopped and shifted from meeting you as a stranger. Now I'm like a wild caged animal, lying by the swimming pool trying to avoid danger. But my lust for life keeps me alive." Referring to Dolores swimming in swimming pools any chance she can get, as well as Nabokov's own reflection on writing Lolita, saying, "As far as I can recall, the initial shiver of inspiration for Lolita was somehow prompted by a newspaper story about an ape in the Jardin des Plantes, who after months of coaxing by a scientist, produced the first drawing ever charcoaled by an animal. This sketch showed the bars of the poor creature's cage." Whereas the studio version opens with the lines, "We're the masters of our own fate, we're the captains of our own souls," which is a reference to the poem Invictus by William Henley, which is the perfect description of making your own choices in a doomed and tragic world, even as your fate closes in on you. To read the last two stanzas of the poem, "Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. And yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." And with that, we see Dolores make her final choice in the text when Humbert asks her, "Are you quite sure that, well, not tomorrow, of course, and not after tomorrow, but, well, someday, any day, you will not come to live with me? I will create a brand new God and thank him with piercing cries if you give me that microscopic hope." "No," she said, smiling. "No. It would have made all the difference," said Humbert. With this passage thematically being the final nail in the coffin of Humbert's solipsism, he is forced to recognize that he did actually ruin her life, abuse her so much that she does not choose to be with him, that she can make her own independent choices separately from his desires, and that there is no God he can pray to make Dolores love him back. She is fully out of his control. And the funny thing about this is that this is what Humbert declared he wanted from the very beginning, a Lilith or an equal capable of leaving him, rather than a woman made of his own construction of his own self, like Eve was from Adam's rib. He also previously described Lolita as having, quote, "Nymphian evil breathing through every pore of the fey child, much as Lilith does in religious stories where she is portrayed as a succubus demon." But, as Humbert says, quote, "It is easy for the reader and me to decipher now a past destiny. But a destiny in the making is, believe me, not one of those honest mystery stories where all you have to do is keep an eye on the clues. That is not McFate's way, even if one does learn to recognize certain obscure indications." With this aspect of his desire, much as Lolita resembling Venus, driving his actions forward through his subconscious. And to quote the famous Carl Jung quote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." With Humbert finishing this scene, writing, "Then I pulled out my automatic. I mean, this is the kind of fool thing a reader might suppose I did. It never even occurred to me to do it. Goodbye, I," she chanted, "my American sweet, immortal, dead love. For she is dead and immortal if you are reading this. I mean, such is the formal agreement with the so-called authorities." Referring to the ending of the song Carmen in the text, And just as he speaks to Dolores in French throughout the novel, we can also translate the French verses in Lana's song Carmen, which highlight his desperation and new plan of action at this point in the story. It translates to, "My love, I know that you love me too. You need me in your life. You can't live without me, and I'd die without you. I'd kill for you." And deciding to kill for her, he hunts down Claire Quilty, with this motivation highlighted back in Lana's song High by the Beach through the lines, "Anyone can start again, not through love, but through revenge. Through the fire, we're born again. Peace by vengeance brings the end." Part 5. Peace by vengeance brings the end. Finding Claire Quilty and holding him at gunpoint, Humbert expresses his desire to take revenge against heaven for punishing him on that immortal day with Annabelle. Humbert suggests that he, quote, "read his own sentence in the poetical form I had given it. The term poetical justice is one that may most happily be used in this respect." I handed him a neat typescript. And I'll abridge Humbert's poem for clarity, quote, "Because you took advantage of a sinner, because you took advantage of my disadvantage when I stood atom naked before a federal law and all its stinging stars, because you took advantage of a sin when I was helpless, molting, moist and tender, hoping for the best, because you took advantage of my inner essential innocence, because you cheated me of my redemption, because you took her at the age when lads play with erector sets, because of all you did, because of all I did not, you have to die." Then, both dressed in the same purple robes, we get this image. We rolled all over the floor, in each other's arms, like two huge helpless children. He was naked and goatish under his robe, and I felt suffocated as he rolled over me. I rolled over him. We rolled over me. They rolled over him. We rolled over us. Showing the two men competing for dominance as godlike figures, wearing their purple robes not only because that is what Jesus is mockingly dressed in for being king of the Jews in Christianity, or as the subsequent liturgical symbol in Christianity for sacrifice and repentance, but also a mixing of the colors of the Aztec red convertible and Humbert's blue sedan from the last time that we met the Arachne web metaphor. It's all coming together now. And finally, just as Jesus wept and prayed in the garden when facing his final fate, Humbert faces his final fate when he decides to kill Claire Quilty, with his own loss of innocence before the law described as such. "I hit him at a very close range through the blankets, and then he lay back, and a big pink bubble with juvenile connotations formed on his lips, grew to the size of a toy balloon, and vanished." And reflecting on his fate with the Quilty as God metaphor continued, he muses, "This, I said to myself, was the end of the ingenious play staged for me by Quilty." And here I will kind of scratch the surface of the largest meta-narrative throughout the text, which is of the enchanted hunters motif. Being the name of the hotel in which Dolores is first raped, it's also where Claire Quilty was writing his play of the same name, which Dolores acted in Beardsley before deciding to run off with him, and was the one warning Humbert when illuminating an old man's face. Furthermore, early on in the hotel, Humbert describes his initial purpose for writing Lolita, saying, "I am trying to describe these things not to relive them in my present boundless misery, but to sort out the portion of hell and the portion of heaven in that strange, awful, maddening world, nymphet love. The beastly and beautiful merged at one point, and it is that borderline I would like to fix, and I feel I fail to do so utterly. Why?" And when reading the screenplay in Beardsley, he notes that Dolores' role is as a woodland witch surrounded by dancing nymphs, who is told by a young poet that she and all of the fantastical creatures around her are a product of his own creation, that she does not exist outside of him. Humbert writes that, "I understood that finally, in utter disgust at his cocksureness, barefooted Dolores was to prove to the braggart that she was not a poet's fancy, but a rustic, down-to-brown earth lass, and a last-minute kiss was to enforce the play's profound message, namely, that mirage and reality merge in love." And at the time, still steeped in his own solipsism and viewing Lolita as his own fantasy construction rather than an independent person, he looks down on the play. The borderline where the beastly and beautiful merge, however, which Humbert can only describe the eternity of through terms like heaven or hell, is this version of platonic love in which the solipsistic love feelings you experience and the independent humanity of the other overlap to some degree. That recognition that you are not the only thing that exists in the universe, that there is a higher divine beauty or power that you can merely glimpse at through this intersection. That's the love that is described here. That is kind of the main theme of the book. People say Lolita is not a love story, and I understand what they mean when they say that, but in a metaphysical way, I mean, you could kind of argue that it is. And Plato also believed that falling in love reminds us of an eternal beauty that our soul once had before our birth, which sparks a desire to reunite with that divine form, like I was saying previously. And Humbert actually hints at this notion of eternal beauty when he first is describing Annabelle, saying, "The spiritual and the physical had been blended in us with a perfection that must remain incomprehensible to the matter-of-fact, crude, standard-brained youngsters of today. Long after her death, I felt her thoughts floating through mine. Long before we met, we had the same dreams. We compared notes, we found strange affinities. The same June of the same year, 1919, a stray canary had fluttered into her house and mine, in two widely separated countries. Oh, Lolita, had you loved me thus?" Then contemplating whether or not his excessive desire for that child was only the first evidence of an inherent singularity, with that singularity referring to the divine forms that our souls trapped in human flesh desire to reunite with. And as with Plato's message in Phaedrus, the death of Annabelle caused Humbert to become corrupted and to make a beast out of himself, choosing to control and possess beauty in its mortal form, rather than paying the moral price of leaving that mortal beauty alone and admiring it as something separate from you. With this dichotomy between mortal lust and eternal beauty literally present from the opening lines in the novel, "Light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul," and the dichotomy between Humbert's belief that desire creates a live world as well as the idea that love is unmoving, this is also present in T.S. Eliot's Burnt Notion, with the final stanza being, quote, "Desire itself is movement, not in itself desirable. Love is itself unmoving, only the cause and end of movement. Timeless and undesiring, except in the aspect of time, caught in the form of limitation between unbeing and being. Sudden in a shaft of sunlight, even while the dust moves, there rises the hidden laughter of children in the foliage. Quick now, here, now, always. Ridiculous the waste sad time, stretching before and after." And sure enough, the last live scene we get in the text before Humbert is arrested by the authorities is this one. "What I heard was but the melody of children at play, nothing but that, and so limpid was the air that within this vapor of blended voices, majestic and minute, remote and magically near, frank and divinely enigmatic, one could hear now and then, as if released, an almost articulate spurt of vivid laughter, or the crack of a bat or the clatter of a toy wagon. But it was all really too far for the eye to distinguish any movement in the lightly etched streets. I stood listening to that musical vibration from my lofty slope, to those flashes of separate cries, with a kind of demure murmur for background. And then I knew that the hopelessly poignant thing was not Lolita's absence from my side, but the absence of her voice from that concord." He then reflects that, "When I started, 56 days ago, to write Lolita, first in the psychopathic ward for observation, and then in this well-heated, albeit tumult, seclusion, I thought I would use these notes in toto at my trial, to save not my head, of course, but my soul. In mind composition, however, I realized that I could not parade living Lolita. I still may use parts of this memoir in hermetic sessions, but publication is to be deferred. The following decision I make with all the legal impact and support of a signed testament. I wish this memoir to be published only when Lolita is no longer alive. Thus, neither of us is alive when the reader opens this book." And so, just as he realizes he cannot enjoy any spiritual solace based on what he has done, he also no longer desires trying to save his soul to us, the jury. And so, Lolita ends with this paragraph addressed directly to Dolores. "And do not pity CQ. One had to choose between him and HH, and one wanted HH to exist at least a couple of months longer, so as to have him make you live in the minds of later generations. I am thinking of Oryx and Angels, The Secret of Durable Pigments, Prophetic Sonnets, The Refuge of Art. And this is the only immortality you and I may share, my Lolita." With art being the closest thing to immortality we can achieve in the fallen world, a major theme in Lana's lyrics explored through lines like, "I even think I found God in the flashbulbs of the pretty cameras and without you," or in her song Radio about becoming famous where she sings, "Not even they can stop me now, boy I be flying overhead. Their heavy words can't bring me down, boy I've been raised from the dead," because she's on the radio, or I've got nothing much to live for ever since I found my fame, and God knows I tried, after fulfilling her purpose of immortality in art. And Humbert writing from a tombal seclusion is also a reference to Plato, one of his most famous dictums, soma sema, or a body, a tomb, which refers to the idea that the soul is trapped in physical flesh until it is to be released upon death. And so to analyze the ending of this text in full, I want to look at one of Lana's most recently famous songs about metaphysics, morality, or mortality, and death, which is Did You Know That There's a Tunnel Under Ocean Boulevard, from her album of the same name, which is about an actual tunnel in Los Angeles that is all boarded up from public sight. Did you know that there's a tunnel under Ocean Boulevard? Mosaic ceilings, painted tiles on the wall. I can't help but feel somewhat like my body marred my soul, handmade beauty sealed up by two man-made walls. And I'm like, when's it gonna be my turn? Don't forget me, like the tunnel under Ocean Boulevard. With a song highlighting the notion of the body being a tomb for the soul, where the handmade beauty of God is sealed up by human walls, human flesh as walls, as well as fearing being forgotten after she's gone and all that's left is her music, as well as the fear that her body marred her soul, meaning that that eternal image of her that she hopes to put forward, her entire reason for creating art, will be tainted by the controversies or actions that she has taken part of in the human realm. Much like all of the icons she looks up to, both the 27 Club, as well as Marilyn and Elvis and so on, as well as Lolita herself, because Dolores is always going to be known as a piece of Humbert, because it's told through his perspective and through his notion of her as Lolita, not Dolores Hayes. The fear is that the eternal beauty of the soul will be tainted by man-made or man-recognized images of that soul. It can only ever be defined in human terms. You know, the Venus of Botticelli is not perfect. It is not actual divine beauty. It is a mere glimpse of divine beauty, that theory of forms, that portal into the divine. It will always be tainted by human error, the lack of human consciousness, like our inability to fully get that level of spirituality. Like, it's always going to be tainted by that. And I think that's what Lana is singing about in that song. But finally, to end this section with the last piece of Lana's song Carmen as it relates to the plot. Quote, she laughs like God, her mind's like a diamond. Audio tune lies, she's still shining like lightning. Meaning that even though the song in the text ends with Carmen being shot by her lover, the actual end of Lolita has Dolores being immortalized forever like a god. The audio tune lied in that text. And so to bring us from this section onto the next one on aesthetic bliss, I'd like to end with a quote from John Milton that really highlights the ending of Lolita as well in his most famous polemic against censorship, where he says, "A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life." Part 6. Aesthetic bliss versus moral controversy in art. Sensing in advance that Lolita would be met with a flurry of criticism and calls for censorship upon its publication, it took forever simply to get it published, Nabokov actually opens the novel with a fictional preface by an academic named John Ray, who is tasked with publishing Humbert's manuscript while he's awaiting murder trial. And the function of this preface is to defend the text on both moral and legal grounds. He cites legal precedent defending Lolita from obscenity law, and defends its moral use by writing that, quote, those very scenes that one might ineptly accuse of a sensuous existence of their own are actually the most strictly functional ones in the development of a tragic tale tending unswervingly to nothing less than a moral apotheosis. He then notes the text's potential use in psychiatry circles and says that reading it should, quote, make all of us, parents, social workers, educators, apply ourselves with still greater vigilance and vision to the task of bringing up a better generation in a safer world. This moral priming, however, in its functional use would not be enough to prevent it being banned in England, New Zealand, and Argentina, as well as in France, the country of its original publication, a year afterwards. And while Lolita's publication was met with criticism, censorship, and condemnation for being morally corrosive to society in multiple countries, Nabokov himself responded to its ban in France by separating the work from moral argument altogether, writing, quote, I am neither a reader nor a writer of didactic fiction, and despite John Ray's assertion, Lolita has no moral in tow. For me, a work of fiction exists only insofar as it affords me what I shall bluntly call aesthetic bliss. That is, a sense of being somehow, somewhere, connected with other states of being where art, curiosity, tenderness, kindness, ecstasy, is the norm. And when prompted in 1967 by an interviewer who said, quote, "Your sense of the immorality of the relationship between Humbert Humbert and Lolita is very strong," he replied, "No, it is not my sense of the immorality of the Humbert Humbert-Lolita relationship that is strong. It is Humbert's sense. He cares, I do not. I do not give a damn for public morals in America or elsewhere." And this concept of aesthetic bliss as being something separate from human morality can best be understood through Plato's original and later views on art, as through his theory of forms, with his latter view being developed further by Neoplatonists. That's the entire meta-narrative of Lolita, if you remember. But basically, Plato's original view of art was that it's a copy of a copy, further down on that great chain of being, and because of that, it could lead the public further from the truth. And so he actually argued for the censorship of art and poetry in particular on moral grounds. He didn't want society to become corrupted by this imitation of an imitation. However, as we discussed in Symposium, he later developed his views to understand that through divine inspiration, artists could conglomerate objects in the physical realm that more closely, through their combination, represent divine truth than could be understood through gazing at mere objects by themselves. This is why, while the birth of Venus is made up of individual elements, it's the composition of those elements through color, figure, and shades that transport the viewer to a divine contemplation that can't be achieved by merely looking at the materials of paint, canvas, or glaze as individual objects alone, making it closer to truth on the great chain of being than the materials it's crafted from. And as I'll get into throughout this section, because art exists higher and closer to divine truth than the mere physical life on that great chain of being, it also supersedes any given society's moral customs or social norms. This is why, for instance, Paradise Lost can be banned for 200 years and still be regarded today as one of the best poems of all time and read every single year. Even though some societies may think it's sacrilegious to write about God this way and to, let people have empathy for Satan, because it is a great work of art and because it exists higher on that chain, it outlasts mortal life. And just as Plato's changing views on art, the first and latter views on art, can be seen to contradict and oppose themselves, we also tend to see that exact pendulum swing between art as a social tool for moral and social engineering versus appreciating art for art's sake all throughout time. And in direct conversation with these Platonic notions of art, we see one of the best arguments for aestheticism and art for art's sake over social engineering and morality in Victorian England through the writings of Oscar Wilde, who responded fearlessly to the repressive era that would censor and even imprison him for his own transgressions of said social mores. And so in line with Nabokov's view on art, Wilde also believes that art is separate from morality, writing, quote, "There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all." His most famous maxim, however, and the one very related to the Platonic conversation, comes from his essay, The Decay of Lying, in which he says, "Life imitates art far more than art imitates life," a concept directly referenced by Lana del Rey in Gods and Monsters. It's one of her refrains in that song. Life imitates art. And while this phrase can be confusing if you're not familiar with Plato's theory of forms, unlike my educated viewers who have stuck with me for this long into the video, which is kind of crazy, it's essentially a statement that because art is higher than mortal life on that great chain of being, physical life actually imitates art, which is itself an imitation of divine form, rather than art being below and being an imitation of life. With this divine hierarchy in mind, however, which is actually kind of Wilde's convergence of both Plato's original and latter forms of art, he doesn't view art that imitates life, aka realism, in his essay, as something immoral that should be censored and banned. He rather just views it as incompetent because it doesn't allow for the same spiritual contemplation that, for instance, asceticism does, or romanticism in his essay. He views it as incompetent rather than immoral, writing, quote, "All bad art comes from returning to life and nature and elevating them into ideals. Life and nature may sometimes be used as part of art's rough material, but before they are of any real service to art, they must be translated into artistic conventions. The moment art surrenders its imaginative medium, it surrenders everything." With this translation of everyday life into art being the crux of both Nabokov and Lana del Rey's artwork, they both use glamour and romanticization to elevate the mundane into an ideal, which is exactly why they've been so heavily criticized for romanticizing or glamorizing abuse and so on. But to kick off this discussion of glamour and aestheticism in art, I would like to quote Oscar Wilde again, who says, "Life goes faster than realism, but romanticism is always in front of life," which we can again visually represent on the great chain of being in relation to art. And don't just take Oscar Wilde's word for it, think about the text of Lolita itself. While Nabokov was writing this text, a real-life story that was eerily similar happened to a young girl named Sally Horner, who was kidnapped by a man pretending to be her father and trafficked around the United States. This case is even given brief mention by Humbert Humbert himself, who questions during his moral reckoning that, "Had I done to Dolly, perhaps, what Frank LaSalle, a 50-year-old mechanic, had done to 11-year-old Sally Horner in 1948? But it's not the realism or the facts of this true crime story that gives it its staying power. It's literally its incorporation into Lolita, because crimes like this happen literally all the time, and people just forget about them. In this sense, Nabokov, in a way, is immortalizing Sally Horner, just as Humbert immortalizes Lolita, because Lolita is obviously going to last far longer than any similar true crime story taking place in reality. And this is because it's been translated into artistic conventions. Humbert is a fully fleshed out emotional character that we as audience members are able to sympathize with through his glamorization, only to have that experience shattered when he describes Lolita's mental state or something awful that he does to her, which is pretty much the defining reading experience of Lolita. It's essentially experiencing the cycle of abuse over and over and over again, but with a little bit of sympathy through the monster, which makes it even more disgusting. If Lolita was just a factual account of a child being raped over and over and over again, it would be so banal and also so revolting that nobody would read it, and it would just end in the dustbin of history. And while Oscar Wilde writes of his own time that, quote, "If something cannot be done to check, or at least to modify, our monstrous worship of facts, art will become sterile and beauty will pass away from the land." Lana similarly responds to the cultural criticisms and demands for realism of her time and the moral didacticism of our period, specifically in response to outrage over her lyric on ultraviolence, "He hit me and it felt like a kiss," by saying, "This is just my experience in my own relationships thus far. It's not going to be my full story. That's why I've been polarizing, because people don't want to look at the broader picture sometimes, they just want to stick to the facts." With the facts around abusive relationships in today's day and time being a very black and white one, where you're not allowed to have any feelings of love or romanticism towards your abuser. You have to just outright morally say they are, an awful abusive predator, and you're an empowered woman, so why would you ever feel any kind of sympathy for that person? Ironically, however, by demanding that art stick to these moral confines and facts of physical matter, it blocks off that portal to the divine, and it also therefore cuts off our access to the emotional truths that can't be reasoned through, that we can't just arrive at through pure intellectual function. That is kind of, to me, the biggest aspect of art that I appreciate. It paints an emotional landscape. It gives you access to feelings inside of you that you otherwise wouldn't be able to access. They just remain subconscious. And so when it comes to understanding Oscar Wilde's defense of lying in terms of romanticism, we can better understand how this reveals greater truths through both Lana del Rey and Nabokov's use of aestheticization and glamorization in their art. And to start with what glamour and thereby glamorization is, it's essentially a process of selectively concealing and selectively revealing a subject matter to present it in an abstracted and impressionistic way. To use an example from fashion, veils are considered glamorous because of its simultaneous revealing and concealing of the subject matter, which both beckons the eye inwards to it, while simultaneously keeping you at a distance. We can also see this function of glamour alongside other relevant uses for the purposes of this section through two definitions from a 1913 dictionary, which are 1, a kind of haze in the air, causing things to appear different from what they really are, and 2, any artificial interest in or association with an object through which it appears delusively magnified or glorified. And when it comes to glamour as a mystifying and abstracting haze, hence its later associations with moody lighting and Hollywood glamour shots, we see this used directly in Lolita through the name of our subject, Dolores Hayes, as well as Humbert glamorizing her name when he sees it amongst a list of her classmates by saying, quote, "I'm trying to analyze the spine thrill of delight it gives me, this name among all those others. What is it that excites me almost to tears, hot, opalescent, thick tears that poets and lovers shed? What is it? The tender anonymity of this name with its formal veil, Dolores, and that abstract transposition of first name and surname, which is like a pair of new pale gloves or a mask? Is mask the key word? Is it because there is always delight in the semi-translucent mystery, the flowing charshaft, through which the flesh and the eye you alone are elected to know smile in passing at you alone? Or is it because I can imagine so well the rest of the colorful classroom around my dolorous and hazy darling, with dolorous defined as, quote, feeling or expressing great sorrow or distress, and the prefix dolor in Dolores' name, meaning pain." Humbert also writes about his pedophilia in romantic terms, saying, "You have to be an artist and a madman, a creature of infinite melancholy, with a bubble of hot poison in your loins and a super voluptuous flame permanently aglow in your subtle spine. Oh, you have to cringe and hide, in order to discern at once, by ineffable signs, the little deadly demon among the wholesome children. She stands unrecognized by them and unconscious herself of her fantastic power." And while, as readers from the outside, we can tell that this is obviously a psychopath trying to convince the jury that his crimes are justifiable by painting them in a romantic light, I think it's important to understand why we sympathize with romanticism in the first place and why he uses this as a tactic to get the jury on his side. And that is because, like it or not, we all engage in romanticism and glamorization in order to cope in a fallen world. We selectively focus on and ignore other behaviors or states of beings and our loved ones in order to continue holding them in a positive light. We practice gratitude in the moment over small things like a fresh-baked muffin or a morning latte, thereby placing them on the pedestal of romanticism and art, or taste and flavor in this case, rather than denigrating them to their pure practical function as the matter and energy we need to keep our animal bodies physically alive. And when it comes to engaging with the kind of art Wilde and Plato describe, for instance in an art museum, this glamour also provides at least some amount of escapism from the drudgery of physical life into the world of ideals. And so when it comes to the sympathy function of glamour that exposes us to truths we otherwise wouldn't want to see, the excessively dramatic nature of Humbert's glamorization, and specifically his use of it to justify abuse, causes us to not only engage with a subject matter we'd otherwise recoil from, but to reflect on the lenses of romanticization we engage with in our own lives. Because we all neglect to see the beastly in full stark effect, we all rely on romanticization and glamorization to some degree. This is what allows us to sympathize with Humbert, even if we can't relate to his specific condition and predatory nature. And while the entire text of Lolita is written through the glamorized lens of Humbert, at least until it all crumbles away and he's left with, quote, "sterile and selfish vice, all that I canceled and cursed," I'd like to turn our focus more towards Dolores' subjectivity if she were to romanticize her experience, as she likely does up until she realizes she's being abused, as in the Off to the Races section. But to do that, I'd like to discuss Lana Del Rey's use of glamour.
Am I glamorous, baby, am I glamorous?
And so Lana Del Rey is obviously a very glamorous figure, from aesthetics to songwriting, with her even describing choosing her own stage name by saying, quote, "I wanted a name I could shape the music towards. Lana Del Rey reminded us of the glamour of the seaside. It sounded gorgeous coming off the tip of the tongue. And when it comes to the dark subject matter she sings about, it's by selectively concealing the tragic aspects of abuse and selectively revealing the romantic aspects that allow us to understand this aspect of that emotional experience, which is otherwise confusing for a lot of people. For instance, in songs like Pretty When I Cry, Sad Girl, and so on, the reason why people get upset at this kind of music is because they're trying to turn away from that aspect of those truths, whether because they think it will send people down the wrong path, or because it's just too uncomfortable for them to deal with. But to me, of course, as I said earlier, I think emotional experiences are best understood through the abstract arts because emotional experiences are abstract and oftentimes not logical. This is also the same thing Oscar Wilde believes in when it comes to the spirit of an age. He writes, quote, "The spirit of an age may be best expressed in the abstract ideal arts, for the spirit itself is abstract and ideal." And so, much as the theme of the Enchanted Hunters play in Lolita is that mirage and reality merge in love, it's the intentional commingling of reality, the physical world, the mundane, with divine artistic conceptions that elevate man into seeing life through the mirror that it is, offering both a portal to the divine above us and an ability to conceptualize the world of beasts below as we become suspended between realms. And so with this notion as art being on a separate realm from the morality of a time period, I want to discuss what happens when you try to reduce art to utility, specifically moral and social utility, as we've seen throughout the ages with censorship and so on, through the arguments of Oscar Wilde and Lana del Rey. Lana del Rey has long been criticized for being anti-feminist, and people get mad that she doesn't stick to a specific ideological doctrine in order to propagate the moral values of that group. One of many examples of this can be seen through a New York Times article on ultraviolence, where the interviewer writes, quote, "A recurring criticism was that her songs about being swept away by love were anti-feminist in their passivity. She contends that she was writing about private, immediate feelings, not setting out doctrine." With Lana responding, "For me, the argument of feminism never really should have come into the picture, because I don't know too much about the history of feminism, and so I'm not really a relevant person to bring into the conversation. Everything I was writing was so autobiographical, it could really only be a personal analysis." And I think Oscar Wilde sums up the character of these moral nitpickers best when he writes, "Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault." And so ideologues, along with Plato's original conception of art, believe in censoring and banning art in fear that it will corrupt man to beast, while unfortunately not realizing that they are actually the ones corrupting man to beast by giving us access only to the bleakest aspects of mortal existence in a fallen world. And so moving towards the appreciation of art for art's sake, I'd like to explore some of the shared aesthetics between Lolita and Lana del Rey, how both works have been aesthetically repurposed by fans, and how this aestheticization keeps the legacy of Dolores Haze alive across generations. When it comes to the imaginative function of romanticism over realism, Oscar Wilde writes, "The more imitative an art is, the less it represents to us the spirit of its age. The more abstract, the more ideal an art is, the more it reveals to us the temper of its age. No great artist sees things as they really are. If he did, he would cease to be an artist." Which is an idea shared by Nabokov, who wrote in response to his abstract use of symbols and colors that, quote, "There exist novelists and poets and ecclesiastic writers who deliberately use color terms or numbers in a strictly symbolic sense. The type of writer I am, half painter, half naturalist, finds the use of symbols hateful because it substitutes a dead general idea for a live specific impression. When the intellect limits itself to the general notion or primitive notion of a certain color, it deprives the sense of its shades." Meaning that rather engage in the stereotypical function of a symbol or color, for instance, blue being a stand-in for sad, Nabokov argues for a more abstract and impressionistic way of viewing colors, which is exactly how he uses the color blue. It's probably the color he writes about the most in Lolita to describe all kinds of different emotions and feelings, even to the point where Humbert annoys his girlfriend who he gets when he's separated from Dolores by singing her a poem saying, "The place was called Enchanted Hunter's Query. What Indian dyes, Diana, did thy dell endorse to make of Picture Lake a very bloodbath of trees before the Blue Hotel?" To which his girlfriend responds to the description of the hotel saying, "Why blue when it is white? Why blue for heaven's sake?" and started to cry again. And as all Lana fans know, the color she is probably most singing about is the color blue. She also uses it for a variety of purposes. I'll put some of the lyrics up on the screens all throughout her discography. And this again just shows the abstract ways in which she uses imagery to define a live specific impression, in the words of Nabokov. And outside the use of color, of course, one of the largest shared aesthetics between Lolita and Lana del Rey is their use of post-war American imagery, the 1950s diners and milkshakes and vintage cars and so on, with Nabokov writing, "Another charge which some readers have made is that Lolita is anti-American. This is something that pains me considerably more than the idiotic accusation of immorality. Considerations of depth and perspective, a suburban lawn, a mountain meadow, led me to build a number of North American sets. I needed a certain exhilarating milieu. Nothing is more exhilarating than Philistine vulgarity." And this Philistine vulgarity plays a huge role in Lana's imagery and lyricism. She loves singing about the highs and lows of American culture and glamorizes low American culture. For instance, biker gangs, prostitution, gas stations, and so on. She also has an entire album named after Norman Rockwell, an idealistic American painter who was not taken seriously during his time period, despite being very popular amongst the masses. She sings, "Give me Hallmark, one dream, one life, one lover. Paint me happy and blue, Norman Rockwell." And off her first album, she has a song called Queen of the Gas Station with lines like, "Love casinos, Indian reservations, but baby, if you love me, take me to the gas station." And saying she dreams of gas stations with Slurpee machines and organs playing, preferably with smoking inside if you can swing it. And referencing Americana and Lolita-themed imagery in her song 1949, it ends with the lines, "Ponytail and lollipops, dinerettes and soda pops, new blue bathing suit, ruche tops, and Cadillacs, blue lake, carded dunks, hopscotch, hot talk, Alabama hard knocks, motel brass locks." And of course, when it comes to the imaginative translation of everyday life into an American aesthetic and ideal, she embodies this in her song Cola with the famous lines, "My pussy tastes like Pepsi Cola, my eyes are wide like cherry pies. I got to taste for men who are older, it's always been so it's no surprise." With the later lyrics, "I fall asleep in an American flag, I wear my diamonds on Skid Row," where she's both satirizing American stereotypes as well as contrasting the highs and lows of American life, hence wearing diamonds on Skid Row, as she is often wont to do. And when it comes to the lasting quality of these aesthetics, even as they're purposed and repurposed again throughout culture, I want to quote Oscar Wilde again, who says, "Art is not symbolic of any age. It is the ages that are her symbols. Because, say it with me,
Life imitates art.
And when it comes to the sovereignty of aesthetics and art over individual cultures, I think the best way to discuss this in terms of Lana Del Rey and Lolita is through the aestheticization and appropriation of the works by users on Tumblr back in the nymphet blog days. And so, back in 2012, alongside the publication of Lana Del Rey's Born to Die and Marina and the Diamonds' Electra Heart, an album exploring similar themes with the title itself being a reference to the Electra complex discussed earlier, the anonymous, non-algorithmic, aesthetically based microblogging site Tumblr was in the process of ascending to its peak popularity, which would be attained around 2014. This site served as the crux of the resurgence of Lolita aesthetics, and to quote Lana in a way that I think best describes the cultural ripeness for Lolita aestheticism at this time, in line with life imitating art, she says, "The way most philosophers have described the timing of people's creativity is that there's a general siphon that we can all draw from that's collective. That's why you'll see so many of the same types of movies come out, like 3 Snow Whites or 3 of the same type of album. It's not on purpose, it seems, it's just in the ether." And what is so distinctively interesting to me about the aestheticization of Lolita on Tumblr specifically is that rather than being a top-down Humbertian perspective on Lolita, I'm talking about the media men of the past who have depicted Lolita as this kind of jailbait, it's instead closer aligned with Dolores Hayes herself because it's young girls themselves who are fashioning themselves after this character and who can relate to her childlike qualities in real time. But when it comes to the borderline deification people on these subcultures had for Lolita, as well as, of course, Lana Del Rey, we see the same thing when it comes to objects that represent other deities, for instance, Greek goddesses. Aphrodite, whom Venus serves as the Roman adaptation of, is often represented through seashells, myrtles, roses, doves, sparrows, and swans. And when it comes to aestheticization on Tumblr, people almost revere objects associated with Lolita with a holy kind of aspect to it, as if it were objects that you place at an altar. And this deification of aesthetics occurs both in nymphet blogs as well as Humbert himself. To read from a blog post titled "When Dolores Hayes Gets a Tumblr, Online Nymphet Culture and the Reclaiming of Lolita" by Mishka Husen, they write, "You see, in the novel, as well as the films, particularly the one by Adrian Lyne, which far outstrips Kubrick's version both in faithfulness to the novel and representation on nymphet blogs, it's the very ordinariness of her girlhood that becomes charged with meaning, beauty, dreadful power. Humbert clutches one of her abandoned bobby pins as he drives on the wrong side of the road, eyes dazed, covered in Quilty's blood. When she leaves for summer camp, Humbert dives into a pile of clothes in her cupboard, pores over the tacked-up magazine cutouts on the wall, clutches her teddy bear as he reads the letter from Charlotte Hayes. She clacks a jawbreaker in her mouth, drumming on his headache till he snaps, 'What is that?' And she sweetly says, 'A jawbreaker. It's supposed to break your jaw. Want one?' And after he forces his hand into her mouth to take it out, She dons a pair of cheap plastic sunglasses and turns to him, saying, "You look 100% better when I can't see you." She's essentially and always a teenage girl, not a temptress, not a succubus or a demon, but a little girl, seen so acutely, so powerfully, that she is written into legend, written into his blood and memory like a curse. The novel describes everything from her eyelashes to her toenails. Her voice shouts out now and then through the flowery words, the elaborate magical misdirection, and these are the moments when the novel is most powerful. When Humbert, along with the reader, knows that there is, quote, in her a garden and a twilight, a palace gate, dim and adorable regions which happen to be lucidly and absolutely forbidden to me, in my polluted rags and miserable convulsions. And just as Humbert, at the height of his solipsism, always remains dimly aware that there is an aspect of Dolores Hayes, her true personhood, that he cannot possess, we know in our aestheticization and self-formations that while we may keep the spirit of Dolores Hayes alive in public consciousness, her independence remains outside of and above us, as she is granted immortality both through Nabokov's prose and our aesthetic representation, as well as the incorporation of her story into the music and image of Lana del Rey. This deification of figures which Lana longs to create out of her own life is seen further in her short film Tropico, as she exists in a paradise where John Wayne is God, and as sung in Body Electric, quote, Elvis is my daddy, Marilyn's my mother, Jesus is my bestest friend. We don't need nobody, 'cause we got each other, or at least I pretend. And, as with the fictional character of Dolores Hayes, Lana idolizes these figures as separate from their mortal bodies, saying in an interview with Clash that, quote, I wrote a little monologue for everyone who came to the premiere of Tropico. When I was studying philosophy, my teacher told me that it's okay to feel like the people you're closest to aren't alive anymore. Sometimes that's the best company to keep. It's about the people that pondered the same questions as you did and had the same sort of life mentality as you. I was upset and inspired by that premise. I knew then, really, that my closest friends would be the people I have never really met before. I was different, and I didn't know many people who felt about mortality how I did. As a result, I do feel a personal connection with the icons. John Wayne, Elvis. I loved how nice Marilyn was. I related to her. Finding girls who are as loving and warm as her is hard. And Lana's goal of deification through art and culture in the same way that happened with Marilyn and Elvis, this desire line can be seen in her music video for Ride, where she states, Every night I used to pray that I'd find my people, and finally I did, on the open road. We had nothing to lose, nothing to gain, nothing we desired anymore, except to make our lives into a work of art. Lana also explicitly portrays herself as a kind of deity in her songs, and is treated as such by many of her fans, which she sometimes plays into satirically, like in her billboard for Coachella asking if anyone else has died for them, in reference to her infamous SNL performance. This deified aspect of Lana is also recognized both by her fans and her critics. In 2015, for Billboard, Bruce Wagner described her story saying, She was tarred as a poser, but it turned out that Del Rey was only at the end of Act 1 in an all-American A Star is Born passion play of celebrity crucifixion and resurrection. And that, the screen that so many gossipy personas have been projected onto, rich preppy, suicidal anti-feminist, morbid dilettante, has instead transformed into a nearly religious dashboard icon of ghostly seduction. In reference to Greek goddesses as well, she sings about overcoming trauma in Fingertips with the lines, I give myself 2 seconds to cry. Let it crash over me like the waves in the sea. Call me Aphrodite, as they bow down to me. Sunbather, moon chaser, queen of empathy. I give myself 2 seconds to breathe and go back to being a serene queen. I just needed 2 seconds to be me. And these lines come right after hearing about the suicide of her uncle just before she's about to sing for the Prince of Monaco, which is a real-life example of the contrast between the larger-than-life experiences she's carved out for herself through celebrity and self-deification, as well as the physical mortal aspects of life and having to deal with death and trauma as a normal person as well. We also see the triggering of her death anxiety through the lyrics, Will I die or will I get to that 10-year mark where I beat the extinction of telomeres? And if I do, will you be there with me, father, sister, brother, as well as, It's a shame that we die. Lana also refers to herself as a deity in response to critics in her song Grandfather, singing, Cause I'm good in spirit, warm-bodied, a fallible deity wrapped up in white. If you don't believe me, my poetry, or my melodies, feel it in your bones. I have good intentions, even if I'm one of the last ones. And while some people may find Lana and any other celebrities self-deification and reference to themselves as being one of the gods as offensive. It was famously Arachne's hubris that got her turned into a spider for forever. I do think Lana is consciously aware of the separation between her mortal experience as Elizabeth Grant and that of Lana del Rey, as referenced in Fingertips, of having to give herself 2 seconds to be me or 2 seconds to cry before going back to that goddess or fallible deity form that she takes in her celebrity life. And I think Lana's consciousness of this separation is best shown through her unreleased song Dragon Slayer, which is about the ideal version that she's formed of herself that is separate from her mortal life. To read lyrics from that song, quote, "You hear a lot of things about her, her reputation's widely known. The people talk, but that don't matter, because to you, she feels like home. She wears a flower crown, she is the people's daughter. She is a Spanish La Lolita, her eyes are green and her dress is gold. Her children young, but her soul is old. She is the father's daughter, patron saint of troubled daughters. Hold your light and you have it true, because you're holy, holy dragon slayer. Maria's prayer, the dragon slayer, she's fighting fire by the sea. Maria's prayer, if you should see her, give her my best wishes for me." With her singing about herself in third person, along with this last line in particular about the separation of her never having met her deified self and to give her her best wishes, a further recognition of the separation between mortal life and the image or legacy that she plans to have live on long after her death, which I think she has achieved. Like, unless the whole world explodes, I think she'll still be relevant. And to end the section by going back to the Arachne metaphor, you guys, so many callbacks in this video, please keep up. Also, I literally have AirPods in with like relaxing music because I've been filming for so long, I'm losing my mind. But when Athena presents herself to Arachne in the disguise of an old woman, she warns her, quote, "Do not reject my advice. Seek great fame amongst mortals for your skill in weaving, but give way to the goddess, and ask her forgiveness, rash girl, with a humble voice. She will forgive you if you will ask." Which is something we see in Lana's Coachella Woodstock in My Mind song referenced earlier with the lines, "I'd trade it all for a stairway to heaven. I'd take my time for the climb up to the top of it. I'd trade the fame and the fortune and the legend. I'd give it all away if you give me just one day to ask him one question." And so here we can assume that the one thing she would ask of God is for her forgiveness. But while immortality, Platonic notions of art and beauty, and the refuge of art serve as the dominant metaphysical themes in Lolita, it is equally, well, not equally known for, most people don't even know it's about those things. It's most widely known for its depictions of abuse, which is also what Lana is most widely known for, even though she also is mostly singing about mortality and death. But with that, I do want to give a decent amount of time to going in deep to the psychology of abuse, and especially grooming, as it's represented in Lolita as well as in the lyricism of Lana del Rey. And so with that, we'll just get on into it. Part 7. The Psychology of Abuse. The conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of psychological trauma. Judith Lewis Herman. In this section, I'm going to be discussing how grooming and abuse are depicted in Lolita, how trauma can feel like a metaphysical curse by God, the nonlinear aspects of healing, and how we can better understand the psychology of abuse through Lana del Rey's discography. And so to begin, I'd like to go through the cycle of grooming as depicted in Lolita through the eyes of Humbert. When it comes to selecting and targeting a victim, Humbert notably falls for a child who he describes, as in the previous section, as being a gloomy child amidst a rosy classroom. She notably has no real family. Her father and her little brother have both died, and her mother hates her. She also had only moved to that town a couple years prior and therefore doesn't really have any friends. And while anyone can be a victim of grooming, these kind of elements, a troubled home life and all of this, really make you more susceptible to predators, unfortunately, because they know that you don't have very many people to tell about what's happening to you, and that you're really desperate for love and affection. And so while in Humbert's psychology, he fits Dolores into a void that he had been seeking to fill, I don't think it's because he just happens to love Dolores because she's so special. I really think it's him realizing that she's an easy target, and that's why he kind of forces her to be the reincarnation of Annabelle, as he puts it. And Humbert recognizes during his moral reckoning that he did rely on Dolores being in a troubled home in order to kind of justify his advances, saying, quote, I may also have relied too much on the abnormally chill relations between Charlotte and her daughter. But the awful point of the whole argument is this. It had become gradually clear to my conventional Lolita during our singular and bestial cohabitation that even the most miserable of family lives was better than the parody of incest, which, in the long run, was the best I could offer the waif. And the next stage of grooming after a victim is selected is giving gifts, favors, compliments, etc. to the child in order to gain their trust in your favor, as well as slowly increasing sexual exposure and contact. And while we've seen this gift-giving element contrasted with Charlotte's hatred for her daughter in the Romeo scene in Lana del Rey's Lolita in the Off to the Races section, when Humbert gives her all of those fancy clothes in the hotel, we also catch glimpses of this earlier. For instance, when Dolores is at summer camp and writes home saying, quote, "Dear Mummy and Hummy, hope you are fine. Thank you very much for the candy. I lost my new sweater in the woods. It has been cold here for the last few days. I'm having a time. Love, Dolly." "The dumb child," said Mrs. Humbert, "has left out a word before time. That sweater was all wool, and I wish you would not send her candy without consulting me." And of course, when it comes to increasing physical contact, we most notoriously see that in the Carmen scene. But even before then, Humbert is gradually touching Dolores more and more, even to the point of holding her hand in the car when they are about to go buy some clothes, the ones that her mom makes her return because they're too cute. And when it comes to the calculated nature of Humbert's actions as well in this aspect of grooming, we see it when Dolores kisses him in the car after he picks her up from camp. He reflects, "I knew, of course, it was but an innocent game on her part. And since, as a psychotherapist, as well as the rapist will tell you, the limits and rules of such girlish games are fluid, or at least too childishly subtle for the senior partner to grasp, I was dreadfully afraid I might go too far and cause her to start back in revulsion and terror. Hence why he takes tiny sips on her, nothing salacious, sipping on her like a Coca-Cola in Lana terms. And this calculated withholding is how he gets Dolores to quote-unquote seduce him, making her feel like it was her choice the whole time by playing aloof and being in that kind of kid space rather than the adult mental space by pretending not to know what sex is and all of that. This is all calculated to make him seem less threatening to her and to make her feel like she's the one who actually started this cycle of abuse. It's really pernicious, and I really wanted to talk about grooming in this section because unfortunately, as with people criticizing Lana for romanticizing abuse, the pernicious aspect of grooming is that you favorably view the person who goes on to abuse you because the whole time they are playing this mind game. Like, Dolores up to this point does have a crush on this handsome man who loves her when her mom doesn't. Why wouldn't she? Especially because she's going through puberty, and people also don't like to admit this, but people are sexually curious at that time. That's kind of the entire point. And the whole reason we have age of consent laws is because we recognize the mental difference between children and adults. So even if a kid has a crush on a 40-year-old or is being groomed and wants it, that doesn't make it okay for her to get raped. It's still the adult's responsibility not to act on that. For some reason, I feel like people don't get that. But the reason that so many victims, unfortunately, of CSA feel so much guilt and shame is because of this element of it. Because they feel like they were asking for it or wanted it in some way, either because of what the abuser tells them or because those feelings of admiration and wanting it were stirred by an adult who was being calculating the entire time. Anyways, it's just really sad because people internalize this feeling of like they brought it upon themselves when it's like, that's not true. Like, this is not Dolores's fault, okay, that Humbert has sex with her. Like, that's not her fault at all. But I just had to say that because I feel like that's something society doesn't understand. And that's why they criticize artists for romanticizing abuse while neglecting to understand that up until the point of abuse and sometimes further on as a coping mechanism, you do have romantic feelings towards your abuser. That's how grooming works. That's how they're able to do it. Humbert even tells her when he's threatening her that she, quote, impaired the morals of an adult, as if the abuse is her fault. This is just classic. This is typical, you guys. This is typical. And actually, you know, as much as people criticize the movie adaptations of Lolita, rightfully so, this novel, like, you can't adapt it. The entire point is that it's through Humbert's perspective and like all of the art is in the literature aspect, like the prose and everything. You can't adapt it correctly to film. But when it comes to the 1997 adaptation, which is the one heavily romanticized on Tumblr, It also, Lana shares some aesthetics with that film as well. I feel like the way people watch this film and why minors might romanticize it on Tumblr is because of the different ways that children and adults view things, the separation mentally. If you're a child going through puberty and suddenly afraid of what boys think of you, while also, in the case of Dolores, seeking a caregiver to fill the role of absent father or loving mother, you might watch Lolita and find the times in which she's picking a wedgie or has ice cream on her face as something relatable that you would normally feel self-conscious about. The fact that this handsome movie star is obsessed with her, despite her being kid-like, registers very differently depending on the audience viewing it. As adults, this makes Humbert's predation especially disgusting, as we're reminded that she's a child and can't understand what's happening to her, and it's extremely uncomfortable. For an insecure child, however, it serves the same effect as those manufactured pop songs that convince girls that their flaws are beautiful in spite of their insecurities in order to make sales, and they may romanticize that or even long to be viewed as the starlet Dolores Hayes. Like, as a child watching, it's like, oh my gosh, this handsome guy still loves this girl even though she has like boogers in her nose and everything, like how I do. It's just read very differently. And I'll be discussing Lana's song A&W in full later on, but to bring some lyrics in here that help highlight what I'm trying to express, she sings in A&W, quote, "If I told you that I was raped, do you really think that anybody would think I didn't ask for it? I didn't ask for it. I won't testify, I already fucked up my story. On top of this, so many other things you can't believe." Which is a very sad stanza in a very sad song, and I'm not here to speculate on what Lana may or may not have gone through because that's her business unless she decides to publicly share that. But I will say that her discography does kind of follow the cycle of grooming and abuse that we see in Lolita. Originally, she has the heart-shaped sunglasses on, she has a crush on this older man with all of the power, she doesn't see herself as a victim, she's just along for the ride. Later on, she kind of romanticizes the abuse when it happens because she can't cope with the reality of the situation. And then she decides to break free psychologically, only to end up in a repetitive trauma compulsion, just repeated victimization over and over again. And all of that I will get to throughout this video. But I say it here because due to people's lack of understanding of the psychology of abuse and especially grooming, people will say like she asked for it and she already fucked up her testimony because of the way she portrayed abuse in the past. And that, to me, is not something Lana has done wrong. She has literally just been expressing herself through art. That, to me, has to do with the public being psychologically illiterate, which is one of the most infuriating aspects of life for me. Like, literally so many issues would resolve so much easier if people just like understood how people think. And in the context of power dynamics, we can understand, feeling like you're the one in control up to a point where you recognize you no longer are. For instance, with Dolores, this happens when she realizes that Humbert lied to her about her mother being dead, and she's actually with a calculated psychopath. She didn't seduce this handsome man because she's a little starlet and everything, and she's actually the one in control. We actually see this dichotomy both in Lana Del Rey's Fishtail, as well as in an interview with Bruce Wagner for Billboard, who asks her, "Are you aware of your effect on men?" To which she replies, "I remember when I was 16, I had a boyfriend. I think he was 25. I thought that that was the best thing. He had an F-150 pickup and let me drive it one time. I was so high up. I panicked and was worried I might kill someone, run over a nun or something. I started to shake. I was screaming and crying. I saw him looking over and he was smiling. He said, 'I love that you're out of control.' He saw how vulnerable I was, how afraid, and he loved that. The balance shifted from there. I had the upper hand until then." And in her song Fishtail, we see this aspect of rose-colored glasses falling off through the lyrics. "Palm trees in black and white, I see in technicolor. Maybe I'll take my glasses off so I stop painting red flags green." With the technicolor beach or palm trees reminding me of this Humbert quote, "Possibilities of sweetness on technicolor beaches have been trickling through my spine for some time." But Lana then goes on to sing, "Lately I've been sunning in the LA riverbed, wearing nothing but the summer bruises on my knees. Don't you dare say that you'll braid my hair, babe. If you don't really care, you wanted me sadder. Baby, you wanted me sadder. Can't you see it? Skip and rope in the bayou, slip softly in terrain. Not that smart, but I've got things to say." With this childlike image of summer bruised knees in the nude, which is both kind of childlike imagery mixed in with sexual innuendo, as well as skipping rope, having your hair braided, playing hopscotch, etc., All of this evokes Lolita imagery for me, and obviously directly relates to her losing those rose-colored romanticized glasses for her abuser. And with those glasses off, she's able to recognize that she actually has value and that her voice matters, even if she internalizes the way other people view her as not smart. For instance, Humbert says this about Dolores, quote, "She's not as intelligent a child as her IQ might suggest." Continuing on with the cycle of abuse, however, once the victim is being abused, the next step is isolating them, sharing secrecies, and threatening them if they are to tell anybody or to escape, basically fearing them into submission. And we see this directly in Lolita when Humbert tells us, quote, "From the very beginning of our concourse, I was clever enough to realize that I must secure her complete cooperation in keeping our relations secret, that it should become a second nature with her, no matter what grudge she might bear me, no matter what other pleasures she might seek." This is at the part of the story when Humbert is threatening Dolores, saying that if she turns him in, she'll end up somewhere much worse because she's an orphan. And while this works, Humbert is not fully satisfied, saying, quote, "But if I managed to establish that background of shared secrecy and shared guilt, I was much less successful in keeping her in good humor." I wonder why. And while at first Dolores has, quote, tornadoes of temper in response to Humbert's abuse, he controls her so completely and isolates her from all other people that she eventually gives up and begins disassociating rather than fighting back. To share two quotes that help highlight this, the first is, "On especially tropical afternoons, in the sticky closeness of the siesta, I liked the cool feel of armchair leather against my massive nakedness as I held her in my lap. There she would be, a typical child picking her nose while engrossed in the lighter sections of a newspaper, as indifferent to my ecstasy as if it were something she had sat upon, a shoe, a doll, the handle of a tennis racket, and was too indolent to remove." And later on, "I have left out the main characteristic of the famous Lolita smile, namely, while the tender, nectared, dimpled brightness played, it was never directed at the stranger in the room, but hung in its own remote flowered void, so to speak, or wandered with myopic softness over chance objects," highlighting Dolores' isolation and her sense of alienation from the world around her. During his moral reckoning as well, Humbert realizes how wrong it was to completely isolate her from other children. The first time she's out of his sight is literally when she escapes him in the hospital, other than being at school when she's being groomed by Quilty. But he says, "When you bear in mind that these were the raised eyebrows and parted lips of a child, you may better appreciate what depths of calculated carnality, what reflected despair, restrained me from falling at her dear feet and dissolving in human tears, and sacrificing my jealousy to whatever pleasure Lolita might hope to derive from mixing with dirty and dangerous children in an outside world that was real to her." But, of course, it's too late, and the damage is done. I think it's also to note that while you may be isolated in a system of abuse, abuse tends to be isolating long after the fact because, again, we live in a psychologically illiterate society, and there's just like a huge disconnect between people who have, faced trauma and people who haven't. It's really difficult for the latter to understand the former, and sometimes vice versa, and that could be really daunting and lonely. Speaking of which, in an interview for NPR, Lana opens up about the polarized response she got from ultraviolence, saying that she used to write in a diary style, and people obviously get really mad at her for that, so she wanted to kind of be more subtle in her approach, which is what she does in Lust for Life, which is why I'm gonna explore some secret hidden lyrical meanings that only people who have read Lolita would pick up on. And so I'm gonna talk about the song 13 Beaches here, which, going back to isolation, opens with a clip from a movie in a distorted and kind of distant audio sound saying, "I don't belong in the world, that's what it is. Something separates me from other people. Everywhere I turn, there's something blocking my escape." And in terms of Lolita reference, we get the lyrics, "It took 13 beaches to find one empty, but finally it's mine. You still can find me, if you ask nicely, underneath the pines, with the daisies, feeling hazy, in the ballroom of my mind, across the county line." With this being a Lolita reference, as Humbert tells us, quote, "The able psychiatrist who studies my case, and whom by now Dr. Humbert has plunged, I trust, into a state of leporine fascination, is no doubt anxious to have me take Lolita to the seaside and have me find there, at last, the gratification of a lifetime urge, and release from the subconscious obsession of an incomplete childhood romance with the initial little Miss Lee. Well, comrade, let me tell you that I did look for a beach, though I also have to confess that by the time we reached its mirage of gray water, so many delights had already been granted to me by my traveling companion that the search for a kingdom by the sea, a sublimated Riviera or whatnot, far from being the impulse of the subconscious, had become the rational pursuit of a purely theoretical thrill. The angels knew it and arranged things accordingly. With the angels blocking his seclusionary escape as he goes to beach after beach after beach, trying to find somewhere to fulfill that desire with Dolores, ending with, consequently, I turned away. I headed my Lolita away from beaches which were either too bleak when lone or too populous when ablaze, instead taking her to a secluded romantic spot 100 feet or so above the pass where we had left our car. The slope seemed untrodden. A last panting pine was taking a well-earned breather on the rock it had reached. Beneath the laprobe I had spread for low, dry flowers crepitated softly. Venus came and went. With Lana referencing the search for a lone beach only to end up underneath the pines on a field of flowers, aka daisies, and she's feeling hazy like Dolores Hayes across the county lines, just as Dolores is being trafficked across county lines. And the reason that this song would be controversial if people understood that it was a Lolita reference is due to the next lyrics, which are, "But I still get lonely, and baby, only then do I let myself recline. Can I let go and let your memory dance in the ballroom of my mind across the county line? It hurts to love you, but I still love you. It's just the way I feel. And I'd be lying if I kept hiding the fact that I can't deal, and that I've been dying for something real." So here, Lana has escaped the abuse and is on her own again, and only when she's completely alone and safe does she allow herself to look into her honest feelings, which are that she still loves him and that it hurts to love him. And that's just the way that she feels, even if the public has an issue with that and her expressing that. Sometimes you have to leave abusers when you actively love them. That's kind of why it's so difficult. Like, that's a huge aspect of why it's difficult. And when you reflect and still feel those nostalgic feelings, those rose-colored feelings are real. They were real. It makes sense to remember them. And it also makes sense, as I discussed in a previous video, to have nostalgia for your past, even when your past was actually really traumatic and fucked up. You can look back on the times when you were a drug addict and partying all the time and view it fondly, even when in reality it was just an awful time. Like, there's all kinds of experiences we look back on with rose-colored glasses. And when it comes to leaving somebody who you love, Dolores tells Humbert on their last meeting about Claire Quilty that, quote, he was the only man she had ever been crazy about, and refused to participate in his films because she only wanted to be intimate with him, not with all these adult men that he's filming her do things with. And because he won't reciprocate that, she knows she has to leave even though she loves him. And when it comes to further hidden Lolita references in Lana songs, that scene underneath the pines ends with this passage, quote, I remember the operation was over, all over, and she was weeping in my arms. A salutary storm of sobs after one of the fits of moodiness that had become so frequent with her in the course of that otherwise admirable year. I had just retracted some silly promise she had forced me to make in a moment of blind, impatient passion, and there she was, sprawling and sobbing, and pinching my caressing hand, and I was laughing happily at the atrocious, unbelievable, unbearable, and I suspect eternal horror that I know now was still but a dot of blackness in the blue of my bliss. With this concept of eternal horror represented through blackness and bliss represented through blue, frequent in many of Lana's songs, specifically when it comes to leaving an abusive relationship or being viewed as a muse rather than a person. Most notably, we get the lyrics in Get Free that, this is my commitment, my modern manifesto. I'm doing it for all of us who never got the chance. For Amy and for Whitney and all my birds of paradise who never got to fly at night because they were caught up in the dance. Sometimes it feels like I've got a war in my mind. I want to get off, but I keep riding the ride. I never really noticed that I had to decide to play someone's game or to live my own life. And now I do. I want to move out of the black into the blue. Which brings us further into the discussion of being a muse versus an independent person, just like there's the solipsized Lolita and the independent Dolores Hayes. And Lana actually discusses this for New York Times, I think, on her album Ultraviolence, saying, quote, it sounds kind of weird, but that is what it's about. And having romantic feelings entwined with the idea of being led and letting go and surrendering. That's always a concept to me. Like I'm wavering between independence and falling into lifestyles and being led. We see this dichotomy furthered in her song Blue Banisters, where she sings, quote, she said, you can't be a muse and be happy too. You can't blacken the pages with Russian poetry and be happy. And that scared me, because I met a man who said he'd come back every May just to help me if I'd paint my banisters blue. With Russian poetry, of course, most likely referring to Lolita and Nabokov, and blue being the bliss that this man is promising her. He says he'll give her children and take away her pain later on in the song. But, spoiler alert, this man never comes, and she has to paint her banisters green and gray instead. And while there are other examples of this use of black and blue, I will finish off with the song Margaret with the lyrics, "Word to all my friends, with their red flags, their white nights, their black eyes, and their blue lies. If you're asking yourself, how do you know? Then that's your answer. The answer is no. You gotta run, run like your head's on fire, run away like your head is on fire." With black eyes and blue lies, again referring to the cycle of abuse where you believe in the heaven someone is saying that they're gonna give you or pretending to give you, when you're actually just being repeatedly bruised and abused. When it comes to leaving an abusive situation, however, it's not enough to just run away like your head is on fire, because until you understand why you engage in that patterns and until you recognize the patterns for what they are, you are likely to fall into repeated patterns of victimization or to even seek out similar circumstances to your abuse over and over again, which is one of the most tragic aspects of abuse, the tendency for repetition of trauma, either subconsciously or consciously. I feel like it's normally subconscious. People can smell victims, they, like predators, can smell victims. They know. And I'll be discussing this idea of repetition compulsion both in secular and metaphysical terms, specifically in the terms of generational trauma or karmic lineage in kind of Buddhist philosophies. But again, a lot of psychoanalysis is unfalsifiable, and a lot of this metaphysical religious stuff is just my interpretation. I'm not setting out any kind of doctrine here. I am not an expert on Buddhism. So please try not to take me in bad faith, but if you're watching me this long, you probably are not. What I'm trying to say is that this is literary analysis. It's nothing more than that, and it's my opinions reading Lolita. But to begin the topic of repeated victimization, I want to quote Lana del Rey in Black Bathing Suit, where she sings, "Swisher sweet, magazines, promise you it's not. 'Cause of you, that I mean, it's my afterthoughts. And what I never said, why there's a price on my head. It's nothing to do with them, it's my karmic lineage. So I'm not friends with my mother, but I still love my dad. Untraditional lover, can you handle that?" So here Lana is expressing the view of having an inherent curse or some form of generational trauma, either through karmic lineage from a previous life or from being actively traumatized by someone in her early childhood, with the concept of afterthoughts to me also being a symptom of trauma. Anyone who's experienced flashbacks or being triggered understands being mean as a result of your afterthoughts when you're re-experiencing a previous trauma and acting it out. And while Lana sings often about being born bad or a bad girl and so on, I want to talk about the ways in which this feeling of inner worthlessness or badness can result from trauma and early childhood experiences. This is also something Dolores says about herself. She calls herself, quote, "a bad, bad girl and a juvenile delinquent, but fair and fetching," likely internalizing the ways others see her, as well as internalizing the view that her mother has of her, which is very common with children. And we see Charlotte's negative view of her daughter throughout, but to give one example here, Humbert tells us, quote, "The rigmarole went year by year, and Mom was supposed to fill out a kind of inventory at each of her child's birthdays. On Lowe's 12th, January 1st, 1947, Charlotte Hayes, née Becker, had underlined the following epithets, 10 out of 40, under your child's personality: aggressive, boisterous, critical, distrustful, impatient, irritable, inquisitive, listless, negativistic, underlined twice, and obstinate. She had ignored the 30 remaining adjectives, among which were cheerful, cooperative, energetic, and so forth. It was really maddening. With a brutality that otherwise never appeared in my loving wife's mild nature, she attacked and routed such of Lowe's little belongings that had wandered to various parts of the house to freeze there like so many hypnotized bunnies." And when it comes to growing up unloved, hated, unwanted, or abused as a child, children oftentimes internalize the sense that it's because something is inherently wrong with them, because biologically, as a survival mechanism, children trust their parents because those parents are the ones keeping them alive. And so at least in Freudian psychology, this creates a split in which if a parent is acting bad, it must be because you're bad, because your parent is supposed to be all good. And this causes children to continually try to win the love and affection of their parents by doing things differently, which is kind of a failing goal when the problem lies with them. And this is why we see repeated abusive relationships that mimic childhood over and over and over again. The idea of repetition compulsion is that you're trying to tie that psychological loop that you've been seeking to tie since childhood. You're with someone abusive and you're trying to change yourself to make them love you because it's just a repetition of you trying to change to make your parents love you. You haven't yet truly, on a visceral level, understood that the issue does not lie within you and that you are not the one inherently bad or wrong, and you have nothing to feel shameful or guilty about. And we see this cycle and the constant attempt to close those kind of loops in Lana's unreleased song, You're Gonna Love Me, through the lines. Jerry says that anytime I think I have a good idea, that I should do the opposite of whatever it is I feel, and that's because I have a bad mind. What God give me a brain for if he won't let me use it? What God give me a plan for? He never helps me do it. You're gonna love me, I'm gonna make you. You're gonna love me, I'm gonna make you. With Lana singing here about internalizing the belief that you're bad, trying to escape the situation but continually failing to, and then giving up and realizing that your best strategy for survival is to make this person love you. Just like a child's best strategy for survival is to make their parent love them. That way they nurture you properly and keep you alive. And when it comes to the repetition of victimization, when Dolores leaves Humbert, she immediately falls for another predator, who is actually so similar to Humbert that he's described throughout as his brother. And there's also a lot of Cain and Abel references. That'll all be in the director's cut because I had to cut so much of it out of my script. But I feel like we can catch a glimpse of this kind of defeated escape in Lana's song Pawn Shop Blues, in a line that makes me cry every time I hear her sing it, where she sings about leaving a relationship saying, I can't do this once more. No man can keep me together. Been broken since I was born. And so when it comes to entering a new cycle of abuse, it often stems from that inner feeling, whether through karmic lineage, generational trauma, your upbringing, etc., that feeling of inner badness, being born bad, that there's something so inherently wrong with you that it goes all the way back to being a child. And in psychology and Buddhist philosophy, when you fail to break your pattern of suffering, whether through ignorance, which allows you to repeat it subconsciously, being unaware of the root of what's happening, or through conscious infliction on others, you're doomed to repeat this cycle either in your next life or onto your next offspring until someone further down breaks that cycle. And we can actually see this in Lolita. We can see what kind of dark reality may have faced Lolita and her future children if she had stayed with Humbert, when he reflects to us that I could switch in the course of the same day from one pole of insanity to the other. From the thought that around 1950 I would have to get rid somehow of a difficult adolescent whose magic nymphage had evaporated, to the thought that with patience and luck, I might have her produce eventually a nymphet with my blood in her exquisite veins, a Lolita II, who would be 8 or 9 around 1960, when I would still be in the prime of life. Indeed, the telescopy of my mind, or unmind, was strong enough to distinguish in the remoteness of time a bizarre, tender, salivating Dr. Humbert practicing on the supremely lovely Lolita III the art of being a granddad. Which to me, I think might be the #1 most disgusting passage in the whole book. I think it actually might be the #1. Thankfully, though, Dolores was able to escape Humbert, even though she ends up in another cycle of abuse. Breaking that chain, however, we can hope that her daughter does not suffer the same fate that she did as a result of generational trauma, and that Dolores was successfully able to break her bad karma. And when it comes to Dolores' tragic life, she tells Humbert during their last meeting, quote, Yes, she said, this world was just one gag after another. If somebody wrote up her life, nobody would believe it. And when it comes to this idea of being cursed by God and repeating your trauma cycles over and over, we also get in Lana's unreleased song, Tired of Singing the Blues, these lines. You know, sometimes I think God is playing a little game with me, looking down from heaven, laughing, and trying to see how much I can take. Because the way things go, it's like a joke. Nobody's had more shots at the moon and missed than me. It's like I got my life stuck on rewind. Trying to make something of myself, life's got something else in mind. I'm fighting a losing game and I'm biding my time. And because patterns are so difficult to break because they keep coming back in different and more subtle forms, I want to talk about repetition compulsion and the reliving of trauma by analyzing Lana's song A&W in full, which has to do with all of this, the cyclic nature of abuse and tragedy. The song opens with the lyrics, I haven't done a cartwheel since I was 9. I haven't seen my mother in a long, long time. And so here, Lana is looking to her past and her loss of innocence. Being told you can't do cartwheels anymore at age 9 is pretty much because that's the beginning of puberty. That's when you need to make sure you keep your legs closed and be aware of the way that men look at you. Your body isn't fully your own anymore. It is something to be consumed by others. And this is kind of when you're a girl child, when you really have to be aware of predators and people sexualizing you, which is unfortunate that it happens so young, but that's reality. Like, ask anybody. That's real life. And when it comes to not having seen her mother in a long, long time, we both get here the idea of a passage of time. She's no longer 9 years old, of course, and she still is dealing with the void left by the abandonment issues that she's gotten from her mother, which I explored in my last video. That's all publicly available information. She then continues, I mean, look at me. Look at the length of my hair, my face, the shape of my body. Do you really think I give a damn what I do after years of just hearing them talking? And again, with your body existing as something to be consumed by other people, this is a reference to the trauma she's faced since becoming famous. She's notoriously had a very difficult time with fame, and she's long been scrutinized for the way that she looks. When she first popped up on the scene, people literally thought she was like fake and inauthentic, I think because she has lip filler. Like, how is that enough to like make all these judgments about somebody, that they're completely hollow and shallow and an industry plant, even though she'd been singing for like 7 years? Like, she's always been an object of ridicule. And then during COVID, when she gained weight, same thing all over again. And so here she's basically saying like, you know what? I don't care what anybody says anymore, which is good. But then of course the song gets sadder. The next lines are, I say I live in Rosemead, really I'm at the Ramada. It doesn't really matter, doesn't really matter. Call him up, come into my bedroom. Ended up, we fuck on the hotel floor. It's not about having someone to love me anymore. This is the experience of being an American whore. And so here, Lana is living out of hotels and having loveless sex, kind of like Lolita being in motels all the time and not actually living in Ramsdale, but instead lying to people that she does. Lana decides here to lean into the box that she's been placed in by other people. And she's also like, of all the songs, she's always singing about love, trying to see the hope in people. She's like completely given up on that at this point and saying it's not about love anymore. This is all about my interior feelings of worthlessness. And so I'm just going to be the whore that everybody says that I am. We then get deeper into the concept of repetition compulsion through the next lines, quote, called up one drunk, called up another. Forensic Files wasn't on. Watching Teenage Diary of a Girl, wondering what went wrong. I'm a princess, I'm divisive, ask me why I'm like this. Maybe I'm just kind of like this, I don't know, maybe I'm just like this. With the next lines being about how no one will believe her rape and that she fucked up her testimony due to the image she previously portrayed. And these lines, in my opinion, refer to sex addiction in a very unglamorous and realistic way. She can't fill the void from her favorite TV shows, so she just has these men on speed dial to again be an American whore. To me, it is literally a repetition of those feelings of low self-worth and just reenacting trauma in that cycle that so many people fall into. And she's basically like, everybody wants to know why I'm like this, why I'm so divisive. This is just my experience. I don't have to like give you some answer that you're able to understand. I don't know why I do this either. The best I can tell you is it has to do with childhood experiences of sexualization and abandonment. But my guess otherwise is as good as yours. Also, I do recommend the movie she references, Diary of a Teenage Girl. It is about a 15-year-old who sleeps with her mother's boyfriend. Kind of Lolita adjacent, but it is a comedy and it's also really good. It's a great depiction of what it feels like to be a teenager. But she then sings, on top of this, so many other things you can't believe. Did you know a singer can still be looking like a side piece at 33? Got a cop who turned on the backbeat, puts a shower on when he calls me, slips out the back door to talk to me. I'm invisible, look how you hold me. I'm invisible, I'm invisible. I'm a ghost now, look how you hold me now. And so while Lana has sung a lot about being the other woman, even covering Nina Simone's song of the same name, it is believed that she did not know that her cop boyfriend of the time was treating her as an affair partner. She didn't know. But either way, it plays into the repetition compulsion thing because, again, she is put into this box that she's tried so hard to escape from, which was of being the other woman, you know, never being fully loved, always being the side piece. And she feels invisible. She feels like a ghost. She doesn't feel fully loved because she's not. She's being treated like an American whore. And she's aware that she's repeating patterns and seeking out these kinds of experiences, but she doesn't know how to stop it. She doesn't know exactly where it's coming from or how to fix it. She gives us ideas of that. But again, it just, to me, shows the very messy cycle of repeated trauma and tragedy. It's very sad. That's all I have to say about this whole video. Is very sad. She then ends with Jimmy only loved me when he wanna get high, with Jim constantly being a stand-in for the name of her abuser, and she is like Dolores Hayes or Lolita, being treated as a drug. She's being used for her body. She's not being seen as an independent person. It has everything to do with the other person's compulsions and nothing to do with her, which again is like Dolores' entire experience. And so now that we've brought the mood down, I guess I'll tell you the ending of Lolita, which is that Dolores dies in childbirth on Christmas Day, giving birth to a daughter. And we know this because her married name is Schiller, and we're told in the preface that Mrs. Schiller dies in childbirth on Christmas Day, giving birth to a daughter. So you don't know until the second time that you read it. But to me, this feels very biblical, you know, a sacrificial death on Jesus's birthday. But while it is a very tragic ending, because people do seek optimism, they want a story like Job, where even though he's punished by God in the worst ways, he's rewarded in the end with something greater. We all want an ending like that. The best that I could give you is that Dolores did break the cycle of karmic lineage. She did break that generational trauma, and hopefully her daughter will grow up to not endure what her mother had to. Just kidding, everybody. I reread the preface while editing this, and it says her daughter was stillborn. So it's a true Shakespearean tragedy where everyone dies in the end. No happy endings here. And I also hope that by understanding our impulse for a happy ending, you know, wanting something good to come out of tragedy, even Dolores Hayes experiences this. When it comes to her favorite book, we get this quote: "There was a gloomy girl, Marian, and there was her stepmother, who explained to Marian that Marian's dead mother had really been a heroic woman, since she had deliberately dissimulated her great love for Marian because she was dying and did not want her child to miss her." Meaning that Dolores chose to see her mother as loving her so much that she was cruel to her in order to prevent her future pain, rather than the more realistic aspect, which is that she was envious of her daughter and didn't like her and wished that she was never born, because that's easier to deal with. And we all want happy endings. We all romanticize pain to some degree. And that's why I can't stand it when people try to censor or criticize the romanticization of experiences in art. But it's okay, because that attempt is futile, because great art exists longer than mortal life, as we have explored. So that situation kind of takes care of itself. As for this video, I'm sure it's going to get age restricted and probably demonetized, but if you could share it, if you really liked it, I hope I was able to provide some entertainment or comfort. I'll have a little clip at the end about bonus content and some other things going on for this channel. Thank you so much for making it this far, if you did. If you comment down below, even like a smiley face or something, it helps so much with the engagement and the algorithm. But yeah, if you have actually watched this whole video, let me know, because this is a big one. You know what I mean? Like, this one's long, so it's not, I don't expect most people to have made it this far. But thank you, and take it away to future Claire for a exciting announcement about the channel. Hello to everyone who has made it this far into the video. I'm going to get straight to the point. I have decided to make a Patreon. It will be launched at the same time as this larger video essay. I did this for two reasons. Number one, some of you have expressed the desire to support my artwork and my channel, which is phenomenal, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is the best way to do that. And then the other reason is, as you can tell, some of my videos take a very long time to make, which means that I am away from my audience for a very long amount of time, which I literally really don't like. Not to be all parasocial, but it's like, I like being able to connect with my audience more frequently. So for Patreon, the goal is to upload at least once a month Patreon exclusive videos on there. If I ever go a month without uploading, I will not charge you guys. That's for anyone who wants more content. Some of my old privated videos are on there right now. I'm going to be uploading a director's cut from this video, you know, bonus scenes from the script very shortly. I also currently have a 30-minute full-on video essay on feminine tragedy as related to Lolita, Lana, and Sylvia Plath on Patreon. That one I will also have individually priced for people who are not interested in Patreon and are only interested in Lolita and Lana Del Rey content, aka this video. You could just get that one by itself if you would like. And that video goes heavily into the biblical curse of the female type, as expressed in Lolita. I talk about the Madonna whore complex, the ephemeral nature of feminine aging. I also talk about, of course, Sylvia Plath, a lot of discussions of similarities between her poetry style and Lana Del Rey's, if any of that is of interest to you. I'd also like to do some like Q&As or podcast style videos on Patreon, just all kinds of things. I'm actually very excited for it. But yeah, If you do sign up for my Patreon, also please do it through a web browser, because apparently if you sign up through the app, Apple takes 30%. Either they charge you an extra 30% or they take 30% of what I would get, or both. I'm not sure. Patreon literally should not be on the App Store based on this deal that they have with Apple. So please do sign up through a laptop browser, as it is literally better for both of us. But yeah, obviously no pressure. Watching the videos is already more than I could ever ask for. I love being able to connect with you guys on this platform because, yeah, it's nice when you spend a lot of time on something that at least another person is going to see it. So thank you to everyone who is watching. I wanted to give that channel announcement, and I will see you guys in my next upload. Bye.